9981st meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing light on the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to Madame Hedda Sampson, Chargée d'Affaires, Interim Chargée d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Special Representative, Mrs. Pramila Patten, and Mrs. Ahmed for their briefings and for shedding light on horrific and heartbreaking crimes that should have no place in our world today. 25 years after the adoption of Resolution 1325 here in this Council, systematic sexual violence continues to be used, including as a weapon of war, primarily targeting women and girls, but men and boys are not spared these crimes. We share the alarm of the Secretary General about the widespread conflict-related sexual violence recorded last year. This must end. Mr. President, the EU is fully committed to eliminating sexual and gender-based violence in all of its forms, in times of peace and conflict. Conflict-related sexual violence and rape are blatant violations of human rights and war crimes. Accountability is of fundamental importance to prevent, deter, and eliminate conflict-related sexual violence. The annual report of the Secretary General and its annexed list of parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of rape and other forms of sexual violence in situations of armed conflict is of critical importance in this regard. This year's report outlines the very concerning trends and concerns in a vast number of conflicts and other situations. We remain deeply concerned with all these situations and condemn all forms of conflict-related sexual violence wherever they occur, be it in Afghanistan, DRC, Haiti, Myanmar, Sudan, Syria, or anywhere else, by state actors or non-state actors, like Hamas. While the report does not formally list the Russian Federation among the parties responsible for conflict-related sexual violence in its annex, it presents clear and credible documentation of over 200 cases of conflict-related sexual violations perpetrated by Russian armed forces against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians. Additionally, the Secretary General expresses grave concern regarding credible information of violations by the Israeli armed and security forces against Palestinians detained or imprisoned. We note the unusual measure by the Secretary General to put the Russian Federation and Israel on notice for potential listing in the next report, citing challenges to make definitive determinations regarding patterns, trends, and systematicity of sexual violence due to the consistent denial of access for UN monitors. We call on all parties assessed in this report, including the Russian Federation, a permanent member of this Council, to heed the call of the Secretary General to cease acts of sexual violence, allow access for monitoring purposes, and cooperate with relevant entities. Mr. President, in relation to the focus of today's discussion, we believe this issue of strategies to ensuring life-saving services and protection to survivors of conflict must be addressed in a comprehensive manner, particularly through joint action in 3 ways. First, we confront the root causes of conflict-related sexual violence, dismantling systems, structures, and political narratives that perpetuate gender inequality. The ongoing UN reform must empower the organization to tackle CRSV more effectively, ensuring full coordination across all pillars, including transitional justice and rule of law. Interagency mechanisms such as the team of experts should be used more often and more strategically, with successes replicated. Second, we need to better ensure survivor-centered justice to deter furtherance of conflict. This requires investigation, prosecution, including at national levels, and transitional justice that upholds the rights of survivors. Third, we all share responsibility to back this agenda with resources. Commitments made today must be matched by funding for both accountability and survivor-centered services, from emergency medical care, including sexual and reproductive health care services, to psychosocial support and long-term reintegration. Mr. President, for our part, the EU supports life-saving services and protection to survivors in many contexts. For example, in Haiti, a €6 million partnership with the Alliance for International Medical Action delivers healthcare in high-risk areas, including free services for survivors. In Sudan, we support UNFPA and UNHCR with a total of €9 million to provide life-saving GBV services, including to survivors of CRSV. In Ukraine, our €15 million partnership with UNFPA is reforming SGBV and SRH care services, training over 3,500 healthcare workers and integrating care into national systems. Mr. President, in closing, we welcome many innovative ideas and strategies to ensure services and protection to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence discussed here today. But even our best intentions and efforts in this regard can never heal or make up for the extreme pain and suffering inflicted through these crimes in the first place. So let us all remember and recommit to our obligation to eliminate conflict-related sexual violence in the first place. I thank you.
Agradezco a la señora.
I thank Mrs. Sampson for her statement. I now give the floor to Mr. David Balsaguldis, Special Envoy of the Presidency of the Central American Court of Justice of the Central American Integration System to the United Nations.
Estimado señor presidente del Consejo.
Distinguished President of the Council, I extend the warm regards of our President Cesar Ernesto Salazar of the Republic of El Salvador and Magistrate Gloria Guadalupe Kelly of Honduras. And I'm speaking here at this Security Council meeting in my capacity as Special Envoy for the Presidency of the Central American Court of Justice to the UN of the CICA Central American Integration System. We applaud Panama for the ongoing attention under the current President of the Republic, His Excellency José Raúl Mulino, that he has provided to women's rights and to the fight against sexual violence as a weapon of war during their presidency of the Council and their presidency of the Central American Integration System. The United Nations, from the Alliance of Civilizations and its High Commissioner, Mr. Miguel Ángel Moratinos, to UN Women in particular, under the leadership of Ms. Michelle Bachelet, and the historic Summit on Women in Beijing in 1995, have dedicated huge efforts to promoting the rights of women. We recognise the commendable work of the Assistant Secretary General, Elizabeth Speha, at the Peace Building Support Office, promoting the WPS agenda through initiatives that fight against gender-based violence in conflicts. The Central American Court of Justice is providing to this Security Council its broad jurisprudence on gender matters, aligned with our colleagues from the International Court of Justice in The Hague. We wish to congratulate the international meeting of elected women that took place in December 2024 in the Maria Pita Palace in the city of La Coruña, hosted by Mayor Ines Rey, and the World Peace Forum that took place in November 2024 in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, hosted by the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. We also applaud the significant initiatives to combat violence against women in conflicts led by the Latin American women Silvia Garcia Polanco of the Dominican Republic and Gabriela Cuevas of Mexico during their successful presidencies of the Central American Parliament and the World Interparliamentary Union, as well as the support of senators of Paraguay and Michelini of Uruguay. By way of conclusion, there's a well-known poem in my native language, Galician, which is a sister language to Portuguese and that the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres knows well, by the Galician poet Yolanda Castaño called Elevar as Palpebras, which means lifting your eyelids, seeing the light, really, and this refers to promising beginnings. We all trust in the fact that today's debate in New York will be a promising beginning for a new step, a new stage at the United Nations in the fight to support female victims of violence and in conflict and coordinated action together to defend the rights of women in all parts of the planet, in Central America and across the world. Thank you very much for your attention, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Balsa Guldris. I now give the floor to the delegation of Estonia.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank Panama for organizing today's open debate and the briefers for their presentations. Estonia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, as well as a group of friends of women, peace and security, and would like to emphasize the following points in the national capacity. 25 years after the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1325, conflict-related sexual violence remains a widespread and devastating tactical war. As the Secretary General's latest report makes clear, 2024 saw a rise in verified cases along with record displacement, growing militarization, and shrinking humanitarian space. Women and girls are disproportionately targeted, while men and boys also suffer from these crimes. Conflict-related sexual violence is a grave violation of international law and is recognized as a war crime and a crime against humanity. We must address the causes of these crimes, in particular, impunity. Accountability, as the Secretary General's report rightly stresses, is non-negotiable and must be a priority. Survivors must be at the center of our response, and we must provide the resources needed for comprehensive support, from sexual and reproductive health services to psychological and legal help, and long-term reintegration. President, is it especially alarming that one of the Council's permanent members, the Russian Federation, is credibly documented in the Secretary General's report as responsible for over 200 cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war? The Secretary General has taken a step of placing Russia on notice for potential listing in the annex of the next report. The evidence leaves no doubt that Russia deserves to be there. Russia must end these violations immediately and grant access to independent investigators. Its use of sexual violence as a tool of war is a disgrace to this Council, to international law, and to our shared humanity. For the first time, Hamas has been listed among parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for conflict-related sexual violence. We also note with concern the incidents perpetrated by Israeli armed and security forces, leading to the Secretary General's decision to put Israel on notice. Estonia expresses its deep concern over the horrors that people face in Sudan and commends all victims who had shared their testimony for their bravery. These stories once again show us that a survivor-centered approach is key. President, Estonia remains committed to working with partners to strengthen the UN's capacity to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. We have been a consistent supporter and donor to key UN mechanisms, including to the office and mandate of the Special Representative, the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, as well as UNFPA, UNHCR, and other relevant instruments. We will continue supporting affected countries in delivering services, building national capacities, and ensuring justice. The survivors' courage obliges us to act. Our collective credibility depends on turning the Council's words into action and holding perpetrators to account. I thank you.
I thank the delegation of Estonia for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by commending Panama for its leadership of the Security Council this month and convening this important debate. I also thank Ms. Ahmed for her powerful remarks this morning and Special Representative Patten for her briefing on the Secretary General's report. We align with the statement delivered by Kuwait on behalf of the GCC, as well as the statement delivered by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends for WPS. The report's findings are a stark reminder that conflict-related sexual violence is not just a tragic byproduct of war, but rather a deliberate, brutal, and unlawful weapon of war. The United Arab Emirates unequivocally condemns these heinous crimes and all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. With an alarming increase in the atrocities globally, there are three areas that demand our urgent attention and decisive action. First, we must prioritize the provision of holistic support in conflict settings for survivors of CRSV. A critical component of this should be the establishment and maintenance of one-stop centers that house medical, psychosocial, legal, and protective services all under one roof. This approach ensures that survivors receive support that prioritizes their recovery and their safety, especially those uprooted by conflict. Second, we need to leverage the power of emerging technologies to strengthen monitoring, reporting, and in turn, accountability. Conflict settings require innovative approaches, and tools that leverage AI offer an opportunity to improve our capacity to track and document crimes of CRSV. They can analyze vast quantities of data to identify incidents in real time and detect emerging patterns, as well as provide emergency and long-term digital support to survivors. However, as we deploy such technology, we must do so responsibly and in close collaboration with survivors. Any use of these tools should be rooted in respecting the dignity of survivors to ensure that they are empowered and not exploited. Third, the Security Council must ensure that CRSV is explicitly included as a standalone designation criterion in all relevant sanctions regimes. This will strengthen our ability to deter perpetrators and will assist in holding them accountable. Mr. President, with the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the milestone commemoration of the Beijing Declaration fast approaching, we must remain steadfast in our commitment to ending all forms of violence against women and girls. We must accelerate our efforts, we must innovate our approaches, and we must make sure that our commitment becomes our reality. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of United Arab Emirates for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Latvia.
Mr. President, I sincerely thank Panama for its leadership in convening this debate, and I also thank the briefers, SRSG Pramila Patten and Ms. Ikhlass Ahmed, for their meaningful and impactful contributions. Latvia aligns itself with the statements of the EU and the Group of Friends of WPS. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report documents at least 25% rise in CRSV cases from 2023. Behind these numbers are countless survivors who remain unseen, unheard, and unaccounted. When a conflict begins, systems designed to protect survivors can vanish overnight. But their need for safety and care cannot wait for peace. They need it immediately. And we have witnessed that in Afghanistan, in DRC, Sudan, Israel, occupied Palestinian territory, Ukraine, Yemen, and elsewhere in the world. Latvia has been deeply engaged in supporting survivors of CRSV. Over the past years, our focus has been on Ukraine, where we facilitated the opening of 3 support centers run by local Ukrainian NGOs in cooperation with our own. Their survivors and their families can receive psychological, legal, social, and humanitarian assistance. And this experience has taught us several valuable lessons on delivering multi-sectoral services to survivors during armed conflict. First, partnerships with local organizations are key. They know which communities trust outsiders and which do not. They understand cultural barriers, and their networks extend into remote villages where external stakeholders alone would operate less effectively. Second, CRSV response is different from disaster relief. International attention spikes when a conflict begins, then gradually fades as the conflict fatigue sets in. And what is needed is a long-term commitment. Apart from funding, it is important to strengthen the local capacity and to integrate CRSV response within peace-building efforts after the cessation of hostilities. The trauma leaves long-lasting scars not only on survivors, but on whole communities, survivors' families, and especially the children. And they need support well beyond the end of an armed conflict, because healing does not follow ceasefire timelines. Third, accountability is vital. Trauma-informed evidence gathering is essential to secure justice for survivors and to hold perpetrators accountable. The UN agencies and humanitarian assistance providers play a crucial role in establishing facts and ensuring impartial documentation of CRSV. In addition, member states and civil society can supplement those efforts, like we have supported mobile teams documenting war crimes across Ukraine. Mr. President, to conclude, as long as conflicts and wars exist, use of sexual violence as a weapon of war remains a tragic reality. We can and must act against this perpetual fatalism. The Council has outlined what needs to be done: resolutions on CRSV, the WPS agenda, UN peace operation mandates speak volumes. What matters is their meaningful implementation. Latvia remains firmly committed to this cause through strong partnerships, long-term engagement, and pursuit of justice. And we owe it to the survivors, women and girls, boys and men, whose lives have been torn apart by violence. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Latvia for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Mexico. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Sexual abuse is the prerogative of the victors. From the city-states in ancient Greece to Berlin of 1945, that's been the case. But even well before that and well after. This is a reality that the world, that the UN seeks to build, should eliminate, both in the present and in the future. I would like to thank Panama for convening this open debate. Mexico acknowledges the progress in building an institutional architecture to combat armed conflict-related sexual violence. However, we are deeply, deeply concerned that in spite of having a broad international normative framework and operative structures to prevent and care for the victims, sexual violence and conflicts persists and continues to complicate sustainable peace building. Even more alarming is how widespread it is in current conflicts. Sexual violence is a tactic of war that continues to be used to torture and to punish, leaving behind it lasting scars in people and in entire communities. Now, taking into account that this debate is focused on the importance of ensuring access to multisectoral services of high quality for persons who have survived sexual violence, I would like to highlight the following points. First of all, services should be geared towards the needs of those who have survived these deeply rooted practices, deeply rooted throughout history, in every region of the world and in every culture. Access to sexual health and reproductive health services, mental health services, psychosocial support and legal support, as well as programs of reintegration. All this is essential to properly care for the victims. Secondly, Mexico would like to underscore the importance of ensuring the meaningful participation of women and girls, and in particular the survivors, in the design, implementation, and monitoring of prevention and response strategies to this type of violence. This participation should be meaningful and not merely symbolic. Also, we acknowledge that community organizations led by women play an essential role on the front lines in providing services, and therefore they must have the necessary support. Thirdly, Mexico would like to make an appeal to the Security Council to use all the instruments available to it to confront conflict-related sexual violence. With this in mind, and in line with what is mentioned in the Secretary General's report, it is extremely important to ensure that the parties to a conflict allow access to humanitarian personnel to affected areas and ensure their protection in conformity with international humanitarian law. Fourthly, it is extremely important to implement measures within well-defined timeframes to prevent and confront sexual violence, as well as to ensure its constant monitoring. Elaborating national action plans to address sexual violence with sufficient funding and including multisectoral services. This is an effective tool that could be implemented at the local level in coordination with the United Nations. Mr. President, sexual violence continues to be used with worrying frequency as a weapon of war. And while perpetrators enjoy impunity, the victims continue to be marginalized. This is why Mexico would like to stress that accountability is essential, and we'd like to highlight that allowing unfettered access to the relevant organs of the United Nations is extremely important to conduct comprehensive investigations of the alleged violations and other episodes of conflict-related sexual violence. Lastly, although the provision of services is essential, it's also very important to tackle the structural causes of sexual violence. I'm referring to patriarchal practices and gender violence, as well as the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. The use of these weapons only furthers the vulnerability of women, girls, and boys in a context of conflict. Thank you very much. I thank the delegation of Mexico for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Switzerland. Mr. President, I would like to thank you for organizing this debate, as well as the keynote speakers for their contributions and testimonies. The Secretary General's report paints a grim picture. Rape and other acts of sexual violence continue to be used as a tactic of war, as a means of torture, and to spread terror among the civilian population. Sexual violence is committed in detention in the context of abductions and human trafficking for sexual exploitation. Unfortunately, impunity still remains the norm. I would like to raise the following 3 points. First, Switzerland calls for the respect for international law, in particular international humanitarian law and human rights in all circumstances. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected and not targeted. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, and attacks against humanitarian personnel severely restrict access to essential services for victims of sexual violence. This exacerbates the physical and social consequences they suffer, particularly for women and girls. It is therefore essential to ensure rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance, including for victims of sexual violence. I also recall that international law requires that humanitarian and UN personnel be respected and protected, an obligation reaffirmed by Security Council Resolution 2730, adopted at the initiative of my country. Second, we must ensure that impunity for acts of sexual violence comes to an end. Switzerland also supports the crucial efforts of the International Criminal Court to bring perpetrators to justice. The Security Council must continue to combat impunity and ensure accountability by all means at its disposal, including by adopting designation criteria related to sexual violence and sanctions regimes. Effective accountability is not only a moral and legal obligation, but also the only way to break the vicious cycle of violence and prevent further acts. It is in this same spirit that Switzerland and the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law organized a roundtable last November dedicated to strengthening judicial responses to impunity for sexual and gender-based violence committed in the context of terrorism. Third, where the UN peace operations withdraw, progress made in preventing, protecting against, and responding to sexual violence is put at risk. While states have the primary responsibility to protect civilians, it is essential that the UN also be able to continue to relevant protection and monitoring activities during and after transitions. That is why Switzerland, together with other donors, co-funds the CRSV Multi-Partner Trust Fund, a fund which enables UN action to strengthen prevention, protection, and access to essential services for survivors of sexual violence in 17 conflict-affected contexts, including Mali and Sudan. In addition, Switzerland works closely with local organizations on the front lines of the fight against sexual violence and has been supporting the Global Survivors Fund since 2022, which provides reparations, care, and training to victims of sexual violence. For example, in the DRC, more than 1,000 survivors have already received medical care, psychological support, and compensation. Mr. President, World Humanitarian Day is an opportunity to reiterate our commitment to upholding international law and accountability in cases of violations. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil.
Senhor Presidente.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this important debate. Conflict-related sexual violence constitutes a devastating tactic of war, a grave violation of international law and of international humanitarian law, and a direct threat to international peace and security. Ensuring the rights and security of the survivors of sexual violence in conflicts is not a gesture of kindness or care, but rather what it is a legal and moral obligation and a condition for just, inclusive and lasting peace. As we know, conflicts disproportionately affect women and girls. And this is why policies to prevent violence and conflicts must absolutely include a gender perspective. And this focused on victims and on eliminating structural inequalities. It's essential to guarantee safe, timely, and non-discriminatory access to multi-sectoral services, physical and mental health, psychosocial support, legal assistance, as well as reparations, and this including in contexts of insecurity and where civilian infrastructure is destroyed. Unfettered humanitarian access must be protected and facilitated for all parties. Further, prevention includes ensuring that hospitals are protected as well as health centres and shelters. During transitions or when we're closing peace operations, we must support measures that avoid security voids and that ensure a continuity of protection and assistance to women and girls. We must also recognise and value the essential role of community organisations led by women to respond to conflict-related sexual violence. Furthermore, accountability is essential to break the cycle of impunity. The Council has tools available to it, such as sanctions and lists that must be applied, always with moderation, of course, and respecting due process. It's also important to support survivors in their access to justice and to effective reparations. Mr. President, the full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women at all levels of decision-making is an essential condition for preventing and resolving conflicts. No peace negotiations should take place without them. Brazil is party to the Common Pledge on Women's Participation in Peace Processes, which reaffirms our commitment to gender equality, to inclusive peace, and to the participation of women in mediation efforts. This year, we are commemorating the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1325, which is the cornerstone of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The open debate taking place in October will be an essential opportunity to reaffirm our common commitments and to show concrete progress made, including when it comes to the implementation of the resolutions that address the issue of conflict-related sexual violence. For Brazil, the WPS agenda is a cross-cutting priority. In this regard, we reaffirm our commitment to work to structurally include the gender perspective in peace-building and peacekeeping. Mr. President, we cannot dissociate the use of conflict-related sexual violence to the difficult geopolitical conflicts that we're facing. The increase in violent conflicts and excessive militarization are having a direct and serious impact on the crimes that we're addressing today. Military expenditure is reaching record levels every year, deviating crucial resources that could instead be invested in sustainable development, humanitarian aid, or support for the victims of these atrocious crimes. In order to really respond to these brutal realities, we must place the search for peace at the very heart of our actions. The WPS agenda provides a transformational path, and this is a path that we should all follow. Thank you. I thank the delegation of Brazil for his statement in Spanish. Thank you. And I give the floor now to the delegation of Luxembourg.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Luxembourg is grateful to the Panamanian presidents of the Security Council for having organized this open debate. I thank Madam Pramila Patten and the representative of the civil society of Darfur for their testimony, their work, and their recommendations. Luxembourg fully aligns with the statement of the European Union and with the statement of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. In spite of the resolutions adopted by this Council since 2008 to demand that all parties to an armed conflict to put an end to all actions of sexual violence against civilians, sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war in a climate of almost complete impunity. As every year, reading the report of the Secretary General is unbearable. It shows that sexual violence has profound and multifaceted repercussions on the victims and their communities. Luxembourg would like to offer 3 recommendations. First of all, it's important to strengthen local capacities to train healthcare professionals, social workers, and security forces in assisting the survivors while respecting their dignity and confidentiality. It's also important to ensure the availability of medical services, psychological support, legal assistance, and secure reporting mechanisms. We condemn in the strongest terms the attacks aimed at healthcare infrastructure and the systematic destruction of institutions providing reproductive and sexual health services. It's essential to ensure that the sexual and reproductive rights of all victims of sexual violence and gender-based violence are guaranteed. We also must work together to put an end to impunity and thus ensure justice for survivors, as has been mentioned by many speakers today. In this context, we would like to underscore the key role of the International Criminal Court. rape and other forms of sexual violence are war crimes that could constitute a crime against humanity or a constitutive element of the crime of genocide. We condemn these heinous acts. The perpetrators of these crimes must be held accountable. Lastly, and this will be my third suggestion, Luxembourg encourages the Security Council to continue its efforts to incorporate sexual violence as a designation criteria in sanctions regime that it has established. A more systematic involvement of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General in charge of sexual-based violence committed in conflict, involvement in the work of sanctions committees could improve the exchange of information. Mr. President, Luxembourg will continue to be actively involved in supporting efforts at prevention and combating sexual violence committed during conflict. Thank you very much.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Luxembourg for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy thanks Panama for convening this debate. We commend the Special Representative Patten for her insights and steadfast commitment to this topic, as well as the distinguished representatives of the civil society for their briefings. Italy aligned itself with the statements delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, adding the following remarks in its national capacity. Conflict-related sexual violence remains a deliberate and devastating tactic of war. In 2024, the UN documented over 4,500 cases, more than 90% of which affected women and girls. Addressing this issue demands coordinated, sustained action from this Council, the UN system, and member states. In light of this, Italy strongly believes that humanitarian access must be preserved. We shall promote programs and policies aimed at ensuring that life-saving assistance, physical, psychological, and legal, is accessible and safe for victims and survivors, free from fear of social stigma, intimidation, or reprisal, and delivered without delay or discrimination. Multi-sectoral services remain vital. Italy supports partnerships between UN agencies, local authorities, and women-led organizations to provide medical care, psychological support, legal aid, and economic empowerment, especially in dynamic, high-risk settings. We also believe that the protection of civilian infrastructure, particularly healthcare facilities, is equally critical. We condemn attacks on such facilities and urge full compliance with international humanitarian law to safeguard spaces that provide safety and vital assistance to survivors. It is also important to invest in gender-responsive security and justice sector reforms. This principle should be embedded in the training of military personnel deployed nationally, as well as in UN peacekeeping and special political missions. We support survivor-centered trauma-informed mechanism for accountability. Italy also promotes the meaningful inclusion of women and girls in the design, implementation, and monitoring of conflict-related sexual violence strategies as a cornerstone of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, also through its 5th National Action Plan on WPS released this month. Conflict settings pose heightened vulnerability. Italy stresses the need for comprehensive approaches that combine protection and empowerment, creation of safe spaces, access to justice, livelihood support, and inclusion of displaced women in decisions affecting them. We will continue to work through diplomacy, development cooperation, peacekeeping training, and civil society partnerships to ensure that survivors receive protection, services, and justice, and that perpetrators are held to account. Thank you for your attention.
We thank the delegation of Italy for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. Lithuania thanks Presidency of Panama for organizing this important open debate on the conflict-related sexual violence. We also convey our profound appreciation to Ms. Pramila Patten, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, and her office, for their important work. Lithuania strongly supports the need to strengthen the mandate of the Special Representative in the light of the ongoing UN 80 process. Mr. President, we note with deep concern the significant increase in United Nations verified cases of the conflict-related sexual violence. This alarming 25% rise underscores the urgent need for the strengthened prevention and accountability measures worldwide, including in Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Palestine, Myanmar, and Syrian Arab Republic, and elsewhere. We strongly condemn all cases of sexual violence perpetrated in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It is critical to recognize that sexual violence affects not only women and girls, but also prisoners of war, many of whom, due to stigma and trauma, suffer in silence and are unable to come forward and report these horrific crimes. Allow me to highlight key facts when it comes to sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war. 3 years after 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission and other credible sources within the UN community have documented the systematic use of torture and ill treatment, including widespread sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees by Russian authorities. Ukrainian prisoners of war were subjected to abuse at all stages of captivity, while civilians endured sexual violence from the point of detention through to confinement. Perpetrators were primarily members of the Russian Armed Forces, the Federal Penitentiary Service, and the Federal Security Service. These violations occurred in at least 50 official and 22 unofficial detention sites for prisoners of war, and in 32 official and 40 unofficial facilities detaining civilians, both within temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories and the Russian Federation. In some cases, especially in occupied areas, sexual violence was used alongside killings, particularly following rape. Monitoring and verification efforts have been severely hampered by the Russian Federation's ongoing denial of the access to UN observers, who could only interview survivors after release. The scale and systematic nature of these abuses indicate war crimes and crimes against humanity, underscoring the urgent need for international accountability and survivor-centered justice. Therefore, it is unacceptable that in the fourth year of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the armed forces of the Russian Federation remain excluded from the annexes of the Secretary General's report. This omission constitutes a serious shortcoming, failing to acknowledge substantial evidence of violations and risking the erosion of the credibility and the effectiveness of international accountability frameworks. Full and impartial inclusion is imperative to ensure justice for victims and to hold Russia accountable for all international crimes it continues to commit. Mr. President, having this opportunity, Lithuania, as one of the donors, would like to encourage all member states to maintain and strengthen their support for UN action, the sole system-wide coordination platform that effectively connects the humanitarian, development, and peace-building pillars in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. This collective mechanism enables a coherent and integrated response, facilitates a long-term support for the survivors, and advances efforts to tackle these crimes. Thank you very much.
Agradezco a la delegación de Lituania.
I thank the delegation of Lithuania for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. At the outset, like many other delegations, I want to thank SRSG Pramila Patten for her crucial and vital work against sexual violence and conflict, and Madame Ikhlass Ahmed for her courageous briefing this morning. We further wish to commend the Secretary General for this profound report. This is also a deeply worrying report because yet again conflict-related sexual violence has risen, and we all know too well that these figures only reflect a fraction of the reality. Impunity for perpetrators remains widespread, and most survivors do not receive the support they need and they deserve. Conflict-related sexual violence is not, as the report makes very clear, a byproduct of conflict. It is a strategic weapon in conflict, a weapon used to destroy lives, to tear apart communities, and to instill lasting fear. During our time as Security Council members in 2019-2020, Germany initiated Resolution 2467, putting survivors' needs at the forefront. We thank Panama for highlighting these needs by conveying today's open debate. Mr. President, I would like to raise 3 points quickly. First, we collectively must do more for the victims of sexual and gender-based violence. This includes enhanced efforts to ensure that survivors have access to medical, psychosocial, and essential support services. For many years, Germany has been supporting survivor networks and organizations around the world, and we will continue to do so. Second, we, again, collectively must focus more on accountability to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. And for us, this includes at the core legal services for victims. Member states in the UN system should prioritize survivor-centered justice through witness protection, investigation, prosecution, and transitional justice mechanisms that uphold survivors' rights. I may add that Germany remains firmly committed to accountability, including through upholding the principle of universal jurisdiction. We also continue to strongly support SRSG Patten and the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict, including by providing financial support for their work in Ukraine and Syria. Third and finally, we welcome that this report addresses all parties responsible without taboos or exclusions. We see value in the novel approach of putting actors on notice for listing in subsequent reports. However, we see the need for an open exchange, in particular with regard to the definition of criteria employed in doing so. This being said, with a clear and credible documentation, and here I echo what just my colleague from Lithuania and others said before me, of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian armed forces against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, we regret that the current report fails to list the Russian Federation among the parties responsible for patterns of conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, in conclusion, Germany reiterates the call upon all parties to conflict, especially those assessed in the annual report, to immediately cease all forms of sexual violence, and we urge them to engage with the Special Representative to adopt and implement time-bound commitments to prevent and address this curse. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Alemania.
I thank the delegation of Germany for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Portugal.
Señor Presidente, we commend Panama for convening this open debate, and we thank the Special Representative, Ms. Patten, as well as Ms. Ikhlass Ahmed for their insightful briefings. Let me also express Portugal's deep appreciation for the work of the Special Representative's Office. Portugal aligns itself with the statement by the EU and the group of friends of WPS and adds the following remarks. According to the Secretary-General's latest report, regrettably, conflict-related sexual violence by state and non-state actors is widespreading amid record levels of conflict and displacement. We highlight the increasing exploitation of online and digital technologies to commit, facilitate, and incite sexual violence in conflict situations. We notice with deep concern cases of rape and forced marriage in Afghanistan, driven by the Taliban's restrictions to the civic space and rights of women and girls. And we are appalled by the widespread documented use of sexual violence as a weapon of war in several conflicts around the world, often encouraged by weak national legal frameworks and lack of accountability. And these are the documented cases, but underreporting also remains widespread, driven by a lack of political will, as well as the victim's fear of reprisals, stigma, and social exclusion. In practice, these factors impede justice for the victims and accountability for the perpetrators. Mr. President, concerning the protection of survivors of sexual violence in particular, we highlight the following. First, we need a survivor-centered approach when responding to CRSV, allowing safe and broad access of victims to medical, psychosocial, and legal support. This entails financial and human resources to health institutions and networks, together with security assurances to their staff. Second, ensuring the protection of the survivors goes together with fighting impunity. This requires strengthening national legislation and a sharper focus on the investigation and prosecution phases, as well as the transitional justice mechanisms that ensure accountability while upholding the protection of the survivors and their well-being. Justice for the victims is paramount to sustainable peace. Third, we must improve prevention mechanisms through early warning systems, monitoring, and protection measures in conflict zones. This also requires addressing structural gender inequality by dismantling patriarchal mentalities, biased narratives, and discrimination, especially towards women and girls, that allow sexual violence to be used as a tool of power, social control, and a tactic of war. Enhancing digital accountability is also crucial, including measures against online sexual violence and the misuse of technology to incite or facilitate CRSV. Lastly, a holistic approach is crucial to prevent CRSV, including gender-responsive arms control, the empowerment of all women and girls, and awareness campaigns. As proposed by the Secretary General, we must strengthen monitoring and reporting capacities through UN field presences and partnerships with civil society organizations, and promote political leadership and commitment from states to prevent and respond to CRSV as part of broader peace and security agendas. Mr. President, Portugal pays particular attention to victims of sexual violence. Our fourth National Action Plan on WPS that is about to be adopted develops our national strategies in this regard, namely through measures to increase the number of the already existing offices of support to the victims, to develop awareness campaigns and training courses on sexual violence before the deployment of military, civilian, and humanitarian personnel involved in peacekeeping operations, to enhance the protection of survivors of CRSV by partnering with local NGOs, adopting mission protocols that ensure safe referral, and establishing confidential reporting mechanisms for sexual exploitation and abuse, to provide training courses to all migration services officers on sexual and gender violence, to ensure the adequate provisions of multi-sectoral services as access to justice and legal redress. In closing, let me reaffirm Portugal's staunch commitment to promoting security, sustainable peace, and gender equality. These are key to ensure the equal and full enjoyment of human rights by all individuals, including women and girls, thus preventing the continuous use of sexual violence as an instrument of war and terrorism. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Portugal for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Ireland.
President, thank you for convening today's important debate. Ireland aligns with the statements of the EU and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We reaffirm our support to Special Representative Patten and the work of her office, which is crucial in consistently highlighting one of humanity's most heinous crimes that all too often goes overlooked. And we commend Ms. Ahmed for her bravery and for her briefing us this morning. She reminds us that our approach to CRSV must always be survivor-centric and survivor-led. President, Ireland condemns conflict-related sexual violence in all circumstances, no matter the setting or the perpetrator. We call on all parties committing all forms of CRSV, whether listed in the Secretary-General's report or not, to immediately cease doing so, in accordance with their obligations under international law. Armed conflict is on the rise globally, with a significant surge in 2024. Sexual violence is not an inevitable part of war, just as it is not an inevitable part of any society in peacetime. And yet, as armed conflicts have proliferated and escalated, the use of sexual violence as a tool of war has unfortunately risen. The Secretary-General's report highlights the current appalling levels of CRSV around the world, including in Haiti, Afghanistan, DRC, and elsewhere. In particular, the widespread and repeated perpetration of rape and sexual violence in Sudan points to a crisis of catastrophic proportion. In the context of the ongoing war in Gaza, Ireland condemns the sexual violence perpetrated against Palestinian detainees in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, and against Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. We are gravely concerned that the Israeli blockade on humanitarian access and attacks on health and education centres limit access to life-saving services for survivors, including sexual and reproductive health care. While women and girls constitute the vast majority of victims of CRSV, men and boys have been targeted too, including in Ukraine, where sexual violence has frequently been committed by the Russian authorities as a method of torture in captivity. President, survivors of CRSV are not a homogenous group. Our responses must be shaped by their diverse experiences and needs. We call on all states to ensure that survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in times of both conflict and peace have access to urgent, life-saving services, including sexual and reproductive health care, mental health and psychosocial support, as well as economic and legal services. We commend the work of women-led organisations who so often lead the way, providing meaningful and life-saving support to survivors on the ground. We also recognise the intrinsic relationship between promoting women's participation in economic, political and social spheres and eliminating CRSV. We call for the full, equal and meaningful participation, free from reprisals, of survivors in all peace and security processes, including disarmament and arms control processes. When it comes to accountability for CRSV, impunity unfortunately remains the norm. More needs to be done to prevent, investigate and hold perpetrators accountable for these horrific crimes. We note the Secretary-General's decision to put the Russian Federation and Israel on notice for potential listing in the next reporting period due to significant concerns over patterns of sexual violence and the consistent denial of access for UN monitoring. We emphasise the importance of access and cooperation with investigators to ensure routes to justice for survivors. President, to conclude, the Council and its subsidiary bodies must continue close collaboration with the Special Representative and her office, as well as the UN team of experts on CRSV, whose work has been vital in strengthening national rule of law responses to conflict-related sexual violence. It is high time to translate the political commitment in this room into action. And to do this, the Council must use all available tools. We urge the Council to include CRSV as a standalone designation for all sanctions regimes, and to ensure that all missions adequately support and resource women protection roles. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Ireland for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Canada.
President, I am pleased to speak on behalf of 65 members of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, an informal network representing all 5 regional groups of the UN and the European Union. I wish to thank Panama for convening this important debate and express appreciation to the briefers. The Group of Friends would like to reaffirm 4 points. First, we strongly condemn the use of conflict-related sexual violence by states and non-state armed groups in conflict-affected settings, including in humanitarian crises. We express our deep concern with the rise in verified cases worldwide. Such heinous acts, which especially affect women and girls, are serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and are not an inevitable consequence of conflict. They may amount to, and some are, war crimes. Second, we must ensure that survivors and victims of sexual and gender-based violence, including in conflict-affected settings, receive urgent, life-saving, comprehensive, and trauma-informed services, including sexual and reproductive health services, as well as mental health and psychosocial support, economic and legal services. We commend the role played by women's organizations and other civil society organizations on the ground in this regard. We must redouble our efforts to remove all barriers that prevent survivors and victims from safely reporting sexual and gender-based violence and from accessing essential services, including in conflict-affected settings. Protecting humanitarian personnel, including healthcare workers, their premises, infrastructure, and assets, is critical to this effort. Third, the continued disregard for international humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as impunity for conflict-related sexual violence, and all sexual and gender-based violence must end. More efforts are needed to strengthen the rule of law, address harmful social norms and discriminatory laws, and ensure the prompt and independent investigation and prosecution of these crimes to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable. We must make sure that victims and survivors have access to justice and reparations. We continue to urge the Security Council to use all available tools to prevent and respond to all forms of sexual and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, especially in contexts where peace operations are transitioning or drawing down. The Security Council has shown that it can use targeted sanctions against those who perpetrate and direct sexual and gender-based violence, and we encourage it to take further such action. Fourth, we must address the root causes of such abhorrent violence and human rights violations, including gender inequality, by promoting the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation, as well as the leadership of women in all peace and security processes and at all levels. We emphasize the particular value of survivors' leadership, including to strengthen justice and accountability and to build community resilience. In closing, we would like to express our appreciation for the work of SRSG Patten and her office. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Canada for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Spain. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for organising this debate. Spain aligns itself with the statement already made by the European Union, and in our national capacity, I'd like to make some additional comments. The data included in the annual report of the Secretary-General are, yet again this year, disheartening. They are testament to the constant increase in sexual violence and conflicts as a weapon of war that continues to affect women and girls, for the most part, in a context of record levels of displacement and growing militarisation. As the Secretary-General said on the 19th of June, on the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflicts, the horror of these atrocious crimes lingers a long time after the guns have fallen silent, creating cycles of violence, breaking up families and communities for generations, and undermining victim support networks, and directly affecting the stability of societies on the long term. On the 25th anniversary of the WPS agenda, the member states of the United Nations and this Council must prioritise the fight against this scourge, focusing on victims. To achieve this, we must focus on prevention, with an emphasis on gender equality and the full and meaningful participation of women in all areas of society, support for victims, supporting, among other things, the training of experts on a local level, and accountability. Attacks against civilian infrastructure, in particular against medical missions and barriers to humanitarian access, limit prevention and early alert actions for sexual violence, as well as assistance capacities for victims. Medical and psychosocial care is crucial. At the 34th Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, we put forward an open pledge to strengthen the protection of this. Mr. President, Spain's commitment to the fight against sexual violence and conflicts is included in our humanitarian diplomacy strategy, our feminist foreign policy, and the 6th guiding plan of Spanish cooperation for sustainable development and global solidarity 2024 to 27. We reiterate our support to the Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General on sexual violence and conflicts, including through voluntary contributions to support the work of this office in investigating, carrying out investigations and providing protection for victims. Impunity for sexual violence in conflict is the norm. According to the Secretary-General's report, the international community must act in a decisive manner to break this cycle. Accountability and protection for victims are fundamental instruments for justice and reconciliation. Spain supports the work of the International Criminal Court as a pillar of international criminal justice and a champion of the fight against impunity. This support is reflected in the contributions made by Spain, among others, to the Victims Fund of the International Criminal Court to fund assistance programs and reparation for victims, many of them victims of sexual violence in conflict. Gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls are priorities of Spain's foreign policy. According to preliminary estimates in 2024, 50 million euros were allocated to humanitarian interventions, including largely a gender approach in places like Afghanistan, Palestine or Ukraine. Further, Spain has financed the special appeal of the International Committee of the Red Cross against sexual violence to a total amount of 4.6 million. President, we must work together to promote collective action in the fight against sexual violence and conflicts, protection for victims and prosecuting the perpetrators. This is the only way we will be able to move forward to build peace and justice. Thank you very much. I thank the delegation of Spain for her statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Czechia.
Mr. President, Czechia thanks Panama for convening this important debate and the briefers for their valuable contributions. We also align with the statements delivered by the European Union and by the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. According to the latest report by the Secretary General, in 2024, conflict-related sexual violence continued to rise, devastating lives and communities, with women and girls accounting for the vast majority of survivors. These crimes are not incidental. They're deliberate, systematic, and increasingly employed as a tactic of war and terror. Czechia strongly condemns all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. We call on all parties to immediately cease such violations and encourage the Security Council to utilize all available tools to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, including during transitions and drawdowns of UN peace operations. Mr. President, this year's debate rightly focuses on survivors. We must move beyond condemnation and ensure survivors receive the comprehensive, life-saving support they urgently need. Sexual and reproductive health services, psychosocial care, legal assistance, and support for social inclusion and livelihoods. In recent years, Czechia supported projects addressing gender-based violence in conflict and post-conflict settings, including funding emergency shelters for women, awareness campaigns, and healthcare services, for example, in Ukraine or Gaza. Czechia provides comprehensive support to Ukrainian refugees on its territory, especially women, in the areas of psychosocial assistance and the sexual and reproductive health, including multilingual and online crisis services, peer support networks, and integrated care centers offering psychological, legal, and medical assistance. We underline the need of innovative survival centers approaches to prevent and respond to CRSV and remain committed to supporting survivors globally. Czechia also highlights the critical role of civil society organizations, particularly women-led groups, in delivering frontline support and advocating for survivors. Mr. President, Czechia welcomes the listing of Hamas among the perpetrators of sexual violence and situations of armed conflict in the report. We are appalled by the findings of the report, including sexual violence that occurred in multiple locations during the October attacks and is ongoing reality for many hostages. Mr. President, impunity must end. Czechia calls on all member states to fulfill their obligations under international law and calls for strengthened justice and accountability mechanisms to ensure that cases of conflict-related sexual violence are thoroughly investigated and prosecuted. Finally, we must address the root causes of this violence: gender inequality and exclusion. Czechia remains committed to advancing gender equality and ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and girls in peace and security processes in line with this Council's resolutions. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Czechia.
I thank the delegation of Czechia for its statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Poland.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Poland thanks Panama for convening this debate and SRSG Pramila Patten for her, not only for her briefing today, but for her leadership in combating conflict-related sexual violence. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security delivered by Canada. With the highest number of armed conflicts since World War II and over 110 million displaced persons worldwide, the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war remains one of the gravest and most abhorrent violations of human rights. And, as the Security Council Resolution 1820 affirmed, it is also a threat to peace and security. Survivors are forced to endure the trauma of the crime itself and the abandonment that follows when life-saving services are destroyed or inaccessible and aid providers deliberately targeted. Poland draws on its experience in continuously supporting Ukraine to stress the need for innovative, survivor-centered strategies. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has documented widespread and systemic sexual violence by Russian forces against civilians and prisoners of war, amounting to crimes against humanity and requiring strong international response and continued documentation mandates. The latest report of the UN Secretary General also highlights that Russia has taken no credible steps to prevent or punish these crimes and refuses to cooperate with SRSG Patten and her team. The introduction of a new category in this year's report, parties on notice for potential listing in the next report to the Security Council, is therefore a clear and formal warning from the UN Secretary General to Russia and others that continued impunity could lead to their inclusion on the list of shame. Mr. President, it is from Ukrainian women organizations that Poland has learned that survivors are not merely recipients of aid, but courageous agents of change. Their experience and determination demonstrate the critical importance of ensuring that all strategies place survivors at the center, are sustainable, locally owned, and well-resourced. Assistance must go beyond emergency healthcare to include long-term economic empowerment and access to justice. Conflict-related sexual violence must be documented and prosecuted as war crimes, with survivor-centered, trauma-informed approaches that uphold dignity, promote healing, and ensure accountability. Prevention also requires investment in awareness. By empowering young people to recognize and respond to gender-based violence, comprehensive school education strengthens prevention and fosters broader societal resilience to security threats rooted in gender inequality. Mr. President, Poland stands ready to share its experience and learn from others to ensure that every survivor of conflict-related sexual violence has access to life-saving services, protection, and justice. Muchas gracias.
Agradezco a la delegación de Polonia.
I thank the delegation of Poland for your statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Australia.
Thank you, Chair. We thank Panama for its leadership in convening this important debate. We also thank today's briefers for illustrating the enduring impacts of conflict-related sexual violence on victims, survivors and communities. Chair, sexual violence in conflict is not an incidental aspect of conflict. It is a deliberate and systematic act of war. It terrorises communities, fractures societies and undermines steps towards peace. Last year, over 4,500 verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence were recorded, an 83% increase over 2 years, including mass atrocities in our region in Myanmar. But even these numbers do not represent the scale of the issue. Behind each verified case are countless survivors who remain invisible and are denied basic care and justice. These systemic failures of protection demand ambitious, comprehensive and survivor-centred responses that include mental and physical health, education, legal redress and economic empowerment. Chair, Australia's commitment to gender equality, human rights and preventing and responding to sexual violence in conflict is enduring and multi-layered. First, we know that preventing armed conflict is key to preventing conflict-related sexual violence. This is why Australia invests in gender-responsive conflict prevention and peacebuilding, which seeks to dismantle structural inequalities underpinning violence, including through our partnerships with the Southeast Asian Women Peace Mediators and the Pacific Women Mediators Network. And in South Sudan, Australian peacekeepers have helped champion a new patrolling methodology, specifically designed to prevent conflict-related sexual violence from occurring. Second, through our partnerships with the ICRC and the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, we facilitate the provision of multidisciplinary services to survivors, including sexual and reproductive health rights. Finally, we protect survivors' rights by strengthening accountability and facilitating their access to security and justice services. The Gender Justice Practitioner Hub, established with the support of Australia, provides practical tools and assistance to practitioners working to deliver effective justice for survivors. Australia also supports the critical work of the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict to strengthen the capacity of national authorities to hold perpetrators of such crimes to account. Chair, in this 25th anniversary year, we must confront a sobering reality. The women, peace and security agenda is under threat. We are witnessing a dangerous rollback where commitments are diluted, funding is diverted, and the voices of survivors are frequently sidelined. In this context, we call on all Member States to reaffirm their commitments under Council Resolution 2467 and the preceding 9 resolutions on women, peace and security. Every survivor deserves safety, dignity and the chance to rebuild their life. Let us ensure that when these grave violations occur, survivor-centred access to life-saving services and protection are not the exception, but the norm. I thank you.
I thank the delegation of Australia. And I now give the floor to the delegation of Vietnam.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks Panama for convening this important open debate and the briefers for the valuable insights. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Resolution 1325 and the 30th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women, it is deeply troubling that sexual violence in conflict continue to persist. Vietnam is gravely concerned by the findings of the Secretary General's latest report, which confirms a rise in incidents of CRSV, 92% of which affected women and girls. While the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war continues on a large scale, humanitarian access remains restricted, and attacks on civilian infrastructure further undermine life-saving services. To break the vicious cycle of violence, exclusion, and re-victimization, we believe the response must be comprehensive, encompassing prevention, protection, and recovery, while addressing root causes in gender inequality. It must also remain survivor-centered, upholding the safety, dignity, and empowerment of those affected. In this connection, I would like to emphasize the following points. First and foremost, prevention is critical. We support broadening CRSV early warning indicators in UN peace operations and reinforcing them with technology-based tools such as secure mobile reporting, crowdsourced mapping, and predictive analysis to detect risk earlier and trigger timely protection. Second, protection must also extend to objects indispensable to civilian survival, particularly those essential to women and girls. Medical facilities, water and sanitation systems, and shelters must never be targeted in conflict. Third, victims of sexual violence must be provided with essential recovery services, including healthcare, psychological support, legal aid, and employment opportunities, among others. Fourth, and equally important, sustainable solutions must include women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in peace processes. CRSV prevention and response should be integrated into peace negotiations and agreements from the outset. We echo the Secretary General's call to ensure the deployment of women's protection advisors and gender advisors across peace operations, including in transitions to special political missions and UN country teams. Mr. President, during our Security Council presidency in 2021, Vietnam initiated Resolution 2573 on safeguarding critical civilian infrastructure, including secure pathways to care and protection for women and girls. At home, our national strategy for gender equality for 2021 and 2030 strengthens prevention, services, and reintegration for survivors of gender-based violence. Vietnam will continue to work with all partners to turn these policies and priorities into actions and tangible outcomes on the ground. Together, let us fulfill the promise of lasting protection for women and girls every day in every context. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Vietnam. And then I give the floor to the delegation of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency of Panama for convening this important debate. We are also grateful to SRSG Pramila Patten and Ms. Ikhlass Ahmed for their powerful and sobering briefings. Conflict-related sexual violence is one of the most devastating crimes of war. leaving deep scars on survivors, families, and entire communities. The Secretary General's report highlights a deeply troubled trend of 25% increase from 2023, with the highest number of cases recorded in the Central African Republic, the DRC, Haiti, Somalia, and South Sudan. While women and girls constitute most of victims, men and boys are also affected. The report also confirms what Ukraine knows too well. Russia deliberately uses CRSV as a weapon of war and a tool of torture against civilians and prisoners of war. To date, Ukrainian prosecutors have documented 372 cases, including 136 men, 236 women, and 20 children. These figures capture only part of the real scale, as countless crimes remain hidden by fear, stigma, and the inaccessibility of occupied territories. The crimes include rape, genital violence, forced nudity, threats, and forcing victims to witness the abuse of loved ones. Behind every statistic is a human life. Let me share just one story, that of 33-year-old Natalia Vlasova, abducted in 2019 from occupied Donetsk and held for months in the notorious Izolatia prison. She endured horrific torture and sexual abuse. At one point, she begged to be shot, dead. But her torturers replied that no, she had to suffer. She testified before a sham Russian court, and I quote, "I can only call them maniacs because to take pleasure in inflicting pain on a naked-bound woman and committing all kinds of perversions, ordinary human beings are not capable of such things." End of quote. The court disregarded her testimonies, and in December 2024, she was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Her daughter was only 4 years old when she last saw her mother. Every day, she hopes her mom will finally come back home to her. We demand the immediate release of Natalia, of Irina Danilovich, of 70-year-old Halina Dovgopola, and all Ukrainian civilians, women and men, who remain held in Russia's torture chambers. We further call on Russia to guarantee humane treatment for all prisoners of war and to ensure their prompt exchange. Given the scale and systematic nature of CRSV in Russia's war of aggression, Ukraine continues to call for the listing of the Russian armed forces and the Federal Security FSB, as persistent perpetrators of the CRSV. This is a vital tool to prevent further crimes and protect Ukrainians on occupied territories and in places of detention. President, Ukraine remains resolute in its commitment to ensuring accountability for these heinous crimes and to providing all necessary assistance to survivors. We value the steadfast support of the international community, which strengthens our determination, and we commend the SRSG Patten and UN team of experts for their substantial assistance to the government of Ukraine in advancing these goals. Ukraine has taken decisive actions. Through our framework of cooperation with the United Nations, we have established a nationwide coordination mechanism that brings together state institutions, civil society, and international partners. Building on this foundation, we are now updating our implementation plan to make it more survivor-centered, locally driven, and results-oriented. For the first time, this plan also addresses the needs of children born of CRSV, ensuring their rights, tailored support, and protection from stigma. We are also rolling out an interim reparation mechanisms, and to date, reparations have been approved for 733 individuals. At the same time, we are advancing a comprehensive long-term reparations policy aligned with international standards. Ukraine's expertise in addressing conflict-related sexual violence, tragically gained as a result of Russia's war of aggression, places on us a responsibility to act. Through Ukraine's chairship of the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict during 2025, we seek to transform this painful knowledge into leadership, working alongside with Alliance's 32 members to advance survivor-centered approaches, global cooperation, and solidarity. Our message is clear. Sexual violence in any conflict will never be tolerated. Survivors need justice and support now, not years from now. Perpetrators must be held to account. Today, we call on the Security Council and all member states to unite in pressing Russia for an immediate ceasefire, release of all prisoners, and an end to Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. It's war crimes, it's crimes against humanity. Every day without action means more suffering, more shattered lives. The time to act is now. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Ukraine for her statement, and I now give the floor to Belgium.
Belgium aligns itself with the statements delivered by the EU and a group of friends and thanks Panama for organizing this debate, as well as the special representative of the Secretary General, Mrs. Pramila Patten, and Mrs. Ikhlass Ahmed for their briefings. I have the honor to deliver the following statement in my national capacity. In this symbolic year, in which we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the WPS agenda and the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, Belgium deplores the staggering 25% increase in conflict-related sexual violence. It is clear that we, as international community, have failed the victims and survivors worldwide. My country studied the state and non-state parties listed in the report's annex and calls upon all of them to take immediate action to prevent and address this brutal violence, not in the least in the DRC, Myanmar, Sudan, and Syria. Furthermore, Belgium is alarmed by the patterns of sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian and Israeli armed and security forces that have been consistently documented by the United Nations. After listing Hamas last year, we welcome the Secretary General's decision to place also Israel and the Russian Federation on notice for potential listing in the next report. We urge both of them to immediately cease all acts of sexual violence, make and implement specific time-bound commitments, engage and cooperate with the Secretary General's Special Representative and relevant United Nations entities, in particular by granting them unimpeded access for monitoring purposes. Time and again, this Council has made it clear that conflict-related sexual violence is unacceptable, that it must be met with accountability, grounded in due process, and centered on the rights and needs of survivors. In these challenging times for the multilateral system, and in the context of the UN80 reforms, Belgium reaffirms its strong support to the mandate of the SRSG Sexual Violence in Conflict. A dedicated, high-level special representative of the Secretary General is paramount, and we thank Mrs. Patten for her outstanding work. Belgium also reiterates our support to the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. Their co-led structure provides a model for how the UN can more efficiently and effectively cooperate. They play a vital role in operationalizing the SRSG's mandate. They work hand in hand with national authorities to strengthen legal frameworks, build investigative and prosecutorial capacity, and ensure that justice is delivered. It is of the utmost importance that we continue to protect the specific and complementary character of both mandates. Mr. President, it is clear that sexual violence will only stop if we address its root causes. We are in 2025, and yet we are still dealing with gender inequality. Let us all keep prioritizing the realization of gender equality worldwide, the equal participation of women in decision-making, the inclusion of women's empowerment at the heart of prevention measures, and continued support for women's organizations and human rights defenders. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Bélgica.
I thank the delegation of Belgium, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Norway.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and my own country, Norway. We thank the briefers, SRG, Pramila Patten, and Ikhlass Ahmed for their important contributions and for their tireless work, and also to you, President, and Panama for convening this important meeting. President, as documented in the Secretary General's report, sexual violence continues to be used at scale against civilians during conflicts. This is unacceptable and a crime according to international law. Meanwhile, reduced UN capacity, financial constraints, and a pushback against gender equality risk undermining the international community's ability to prevent and to respond to sexual and gender-based violence, including CRSV. Women and girls in all their diversity continue to be disproportionately affected by CRSV, but men and boys are also victims of these atrocities. LGBTI people face particular risks. We must retain a strong commitment to eliminate all types of gender-based violence, especially systematic conflict-related sexual violence used as a method of warfare. To tackle the underlying drivers, particularly entrenched gender inequality, we must ensure that women can participate safely, fully, and on equal terms in peace and security efforts at every stage and in every forum. Participation of women in de-escalation and mediation efforts is therefore critical. Community-based, women-led organizations and human rights defenders often serve as first responders and play a critical role in providing and advocating for humanitarian aid and services for survivors. Yet, they are frequently under-resourced and operate at great personal risk. President, in this context, the Nordic countries want to highlight 5 priorities. First, ensure that CRSV prevention and response measures are fully integrated and sustained during transitions and drawdowns of UN peace operations. Second, to promote cooperation between the Security Council and relevant regional organizations to ensure a zero-tolerance policy for all types of exploitation and address protection gaps. Third, to secure access to quality, life-saving, multi-sectoral services for survivors, including medical care, mental health, and psychosocial support, economic empowerment, and access to justice, especially in light of shrinking humanitarian space. The sexual and reproductive rights of survivors must be promoted and also protected. Fourth, strengthen accountability by striving to investigate all cases, prosecute perpetrators at national and international levels, list persistent offenders, and include CRSV as a standalone designation criteria for targeted sanctions. Fifth, and lastly, to promote and strengthen the protection of civilians and to uphold human rights as a guiding principle throughout the ongoing UN reform process. Prioritizing the prevention of and response to sexual violence in conflict is integral to sustaining peace, fostering stability, and building society grounded in dignity, equality, and human rights. I thank you, President.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Norway, and I give the floor to Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand commends Panama in convening this important debate and thank Ms. Patten and Ms. Ahmed for their invaluable contributions. Thailand unequivocally condemns sexual violence, both in terms of conflict and in terms of peace, as well as its use as weapons of war. Despite progress since the adoption of UNSC Resolution 1820 of 2008, the SG's latest report confirms that CRSV persists with alarming frequency amid proliferating and escalating conflicts across many regions. We are particularly concerned that CRSV disproportionately affects women and girls. Thailand calls on all parties involved in conflicts to immediately cease all acts of sexual violence and take all appropriate measures to prevent such incidents and to fully implement the relevant UNSC resolutions to ensure the protection of civilians. For today's debate, Thailand wishes to highlight the three key points. First, the most effective way to eliminate CRSV is to prevent conflict in the first place. Thailand stresses the responsibility of all states to resolve disputes peacefully and to build and sustain peace, both within and between countries. In this regard, we recognize the indispensable role of the UN in promoting peace and nonviolence, and in serving as a platform for dialogue and cooperation. We support efforts to strengthen the capacity of the UN in discharging its mandate on peace and security. Second, promoting gender equality must remain central to our efforts. Thailand reaffirms its commitment to the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, as well as to the advancement of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It is crucial to promote and protect the rights of women, empower them, and ensure their meaningful participation at all levels of decision-making. Efforts must be made to reduce pre-existing structural inequalities, eradicate all forms of discrimination, and combat extreme poverty among women and girls. Third, we must integrate preventing and addressing CRSV into every stage of peace processes and peace building. No peace agreement or post-conflict effort can be sustainable if it ignores the security and dignity of women and girls. Thailand advocates for the presence of women peacekeepers on the ground to ensure that women's needs are properly addressed, including in incidents of sexual violence. We support the timely deployment of women's protection advisors in all UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions to engage with parties to the conflict on the issues of CRSV. Mr. President, ending conflict-related sexual violence requires more than words. It demands practical action, sustained political will, and inclusive partnerships among member states, the UN, the regional organizations, and civil society. In this regard, Thailand reaffirms our determination to work with all parties to close the gap between commitment and reality, ensuring that CRSV is eradicated and never tolerated. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Tailandia.
I thank Thailand for your statement, and I give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by thanking the Mission of Panama for convening this important debate. The 2024 report presented in the Security Council today rights a much-needed wrong by the important inclusion of Hamas in the annex of the Secretary General Annual Report on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. The listing reflects undeniable evidence of the atrocities, too horrible to describe, that have been committed by the terrorist organization on October 7th and towards the hostages they held since, including systematic and brutal acts of sexual violence as a tactic of war and terror. However, Israel firmly rejects the notice in the appendix of the report, which we see as an attempt to create a false equivalence between a democratic state governed by the rule of law, defending its citizens, and between a terrorist group committing mass atrocities, which adheres to no law. It undermines the credibility of this mechanism and diverts attention from those truly responsible. The deliberate use of sexual violence as a weapon of war by terrorist organization is tragically not new and not unique to Hamas. The world has not forgotten the crimes committed by ISIS against Yazidi women, one of whom, after years of unimaginable suffering, was recently rescued by Israel from captivity in Hamas-ruled Gaza. We also recall the targeted attacks against Druze women in Syria, atrocities which, unfortunately, received barely a whisper from many international organizations. Such selective silence exposes the reality that, for some, women's rights are secondary to a political agenda. When victims are ignored because they do not fit predetermined narrative, it is not only pure discrimination, it is hypocrisy. The Council must move beyond words It cannot allow a radical terror organization such as Hamas, which answers to no one, which sees systematic sexual abuse, violent rapes, and maiming of its victims as items in its toolkit. A terror organization which has no regard to human rights or law, to voluntarily go against its own modus operandi. The severity of its actions, which have already been recognized in the report's annex, are just another reminder of the fact that it is time for the Council to take the appropriate step and have Hamas and its associated terrorist organizations be immediately designated as terror organizations and sanctioned accordingly. These are not abstract policy measures. They are essential steps to holding perpetrators accountable, deterring future crimes, and affirming that sexual violence in conflict is never met with impunity. We urge the United Nations to act impartially, stand unequivocally with the victims, men and women alike, and ensure that political bias does not obscure the truth. Anything less would be betray the very mandate of this Council. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Israel for your statement, and I give the floor to the delegation of Cyprus.
Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to express our sincere appreciation to the Republic of Panama for organizing this important debate. We thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, for her insightful presentation, and we reiterate our full support to her mandate. We also express our appreciation to Ms. Ahmed for her remarks. Mr. President, we are appalled by the sharp rise of conflict-related sexual violence and the severity and brutality of recorded cases as presented in the recent report of the Secretary General. Cyprus strongly condemns gender-based violence in all its forms and manifestations, online and offline, including all acts of sexual violence during armed conflicts. It is deeply alarming that despite the adoption of landmark resolutions 1325 and 1820, in conflict-affected regions around the world, conflict-related sexual violence is still used as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and political repression. This abhorrent crime is neither incidental nor isolated. It is a manifestation of entrenched historical inequalities and patriarchal power structures. Cyprus recalls that rape and other forms of sexual violence may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts of genocide under international law. Conflict-related sexual violence is a peace and security issue and an impediment to sustainable peace that requires targeted operational and policy responses. Mr. President, allow me to contribute to today's discussion with a few points. Firstly, we should always take into consideration that victims and survivors are not a homogeneous group. They have different experiences, needs, and perspectives that we must take into consideration in addressing their traumas, including the drama of their families. We must ensure access to services, including sexual and reproductive health care services, as well as psychosocial support and legal assistance. It is therefore crucial to strengthen survival-centered and gender and age-responsive, disability-inclusive, and trauma-informed services and programs. Secondly, these heinous crimes cannot be addressed in isolation and should not remain unanswered. The era of impunity of perpetrators of these atrocities must end once and for all. We need to strengthen legal procedures at national, regional, and international levels, ensuring criminal accountability for perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. Furthermore, victims of sexual violence must have equal protection under the law and equal access to justice. Prosecution and accountability are key to ensuring long-lasting peace. Lastly, although women and girls are disproportionately affected by sexual violence in conflict, they remain underrepresented in peace and security decision-making structures. We must adopt concrete measures to ensure the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in all efforts for the maintenance of peace and security, and the full implementation of the peace and security agenda, including in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. Their voices are essential. Mr. President, Cyprus, as a victim of foreign military invasion and ongoing foreign military occupation for 5 decades now, has endured the horrors of conflict-related sexual violence. Conflict-related sexual violence remains an open wound of the Cypriot society. Most victims of rape and sexual violence are suffering in silence all these years, while the occupying power never brought to justice the perpetrators of these horrendous crimes. Mr. President, to conclude, it is imperative to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflict settings and of gender-based violence. Cyprus reaffirms its commitment to working with the international community to strengthen the global response to conflict-related sexual violence, adopt a survivor-centered approach, while at the same time ensure justice and accountability for all victims and survivors. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de Chipre su
I thank Cyprus for your statement, and I give the floor to Egypt.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this year is the 25th anniversary of the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. This was the building block for the creation of an integrated agenda in this field, an agenda that Egypt supports. The inability of the international system to prevent and end conflict coincides with the increasing prevalence of cases of sexual violence in armed conflict, while women and girls remain disproportionately affected by such conflict, including their exposure to the crime of sexual conflict in all its forms in light of the prevailing policy of impunity and the lack of accountability for those responsible for these crimes. My delegation has taken note with interest of the elements of the report under consideration by the Council today, and we thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, for her briefing. We also thank Ms. Ikhlass Ahmed for her testimony, which demonstrates the heinous nature of sexual violence committed by non-state armed militias in Sudan, especially in Darfur, using that as an instrument of war. Here we stress that the best way to prevent serious violations of international humanitarian law and crimes of sexual conflict, sexual violence and conflict, especially in protracted conflicts, when they are systematically used as a tool of war, the best way to do that is to address the root causes of these conflicts, put an end to them, and build a sustainable peace. Mr. President, dealing with this issue requires a comprehensive approach based on conflict prevention and the protection of civilians during conflicts and putting an end to conflicts, as well as providing support and assistance to victims, including ensuring justice, reparation, and sustainable peace. The report found that the largest proportion of the parties involved in committing such violations are non-state armed actors, which calls for removing the support given to such groups and actors, as this support simply prolongs the conditions and continuations of the conflict and limits the ability to protect civilians and administrate justice and hold violators accountable. And here I would like to highlight the worsening situation in Sudan, especially in Darfur, as a result of the non-state armed actors as they continue to target civilians. Most recently, the vicious attack on El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur. Egypt continues in its efforts on all tracks to end the conflict in Sudan and to establish stability in a manner that preserves the unity and integrity and sovereignty of the Sudanese territory, the cohesion of state institutions, and to promote justice and accountability, and to respond to the hopes and aspirations of the Sudanese people with pure Sudanese ownership and leadership. And this effort is in line with our efforts to support Sudanese civilians fleeing the conflict and being hosted by Egypt, as well as our efforts to ensure humanitarian access into Sudan. As for the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, Egypt expresses its grave concern over what the report mentioned and in the appendix in terms of credible information regarding violations perpetrated by the Israeli security forces against Palestinians in places of detention in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, whereas Israel, the occupying power, has not responded to the request to give access to relevant UN bodies to conduct full investigations into the alleged violations, including sexual violence. Moreover, Israel has only provided little information on the accountability measures for alleged incidents of sexual violence, despite witness testimony and digital evidence that Israeli soldiers have committed such abuses. Over a year has passed since the report that included the visit
by the Special Representative to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories has been published, but the situation is unchanged. Egypt reiterates its call on Israel to respond to the request of the Secretary General on the matter, which is reflected in the report and the appendix. Egypt, Mr. President, continues its mediation efforts with Qatar and the United States to achieve an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza and to ensure unhindered humanitarian access. We also are striving to seek to mobilize efforts for Gaza's reconstruction within the framework of the Arab Islamic Reconstruction Plan. We intend to hold an international conference in this context once the ceasefire is reached. Egypt calls for the maintenance of the role and entity of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, the UNRWA, and the return of UN humanitarian teams to the Gaza Strip and their protection. Egypt condemns the Israeli practices in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, while Israel continues to defy international humanitarian law with impunity by blocking aid to Palestinians besieged in Gaza. Egypt rejects the claims of forced displacement and Israel's relentless efforts to consolidate its status of occupation. Preventing violations against the Palestinian people requires an end to the illegal Israeli occupation and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and the implementation of a two-state solution which stipulates the existence of an independent state of Palestine contiguous and viable in the borders of 4 June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, which is what Egypt seeks to achieve because it believes in the just cause of the Palestinian people and the right to self-determination and the central law of this to establish stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the delegation of Egypt for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to thank you for organising this open debate. I thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence for their enlightening briefing. CRSV, Mr. President, is a grave violation of human rights in times of conflict, and it is one of the worst crimes that poses a danger to the whole of society. Above and beyond the attacks against fundamental freedoms, it affects social cohesion, security and stability in all areas of economic, political and social life, which directly harms social and family fabric. The Presidential Directorate and the Yemeni government places a high level of priority on women participating in decision-making as well as in the executive and the judiciary. We are acting in order to boost quotas of women for decision-making roles, and this is reflected in the appointment of tens of women to decision-making roles in the judiciary, especially in the Supreme Council of the Judiciary and within the Executive Directorate of different ministries and governorates. Women participate in planning different programs and projects that are very important for our country, and this is testament to our state's commitment to the participation of women in political decision-making and in managing public affairs. Mr. President, Yemen has sought to take practical measures in order to prevent sexual violence and to protect victims. Thus, we have adopted the National Plan, Women, Peace and Security, and we did this with the participation of concerned government institutions and civil society organisations seeking to strengthen the participation of women in the economic, social and cultural development. A gender perspective is included in all of our efforts. Mr. President, we also attach a particularly high level of attention to capacity building within monitoring, reporting and reparation mechanisms. Victims receive the support of the Union of Yemeni Women in different governorates and working with different representatives of the Public Prosecutor's Office. Courts are working to prevent violence and to provide access to victims to legal assistance, legal aid and access to justice. Women are thus empowered thanks to the creation of centres to help with their rehabilitation. 2 centres in particular have been set up for women victim of violence in Taiz Governorate and Mareb Governorate. Awareness-raising campaigns are also being organised, and several programmes are currently in the launch phase in order to bring in a standard guide as to the procedures for the protection of women and girls who have fallen victim to violence. In terms of the direct response to the needs of women victims of violence, we have strengthened the actions of the National Commission tasked with investigating suspected human rights violations. This is a mechanism which is independent, and its work is facilitated by the government according to the guidance adopted by the Presidential Management Council. The recommendations from this mechanism are implemented in order to fight against impunity and in order to ensure justice and accountability. Mr. President, the Houthi militia are pursuing their flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. This has been documented both nationally and internationally, in particular in the group of experts, the report of the group of experts on Yemen and the report of the Special Representative of the Secretary General in 2024. The Houthi militia uses sexual violence in order to terrorize Yemeni women and to oppress them. Women are targeted and are deprived of the most fundamental rights. They are kidnapped and held in secret prisons, or they fall victim to physical or mental torture. Campaigns have been launched against human rights activists in order to silence them. Over recent years, we have the feminine security services called Zainabiyat. They were mentioned in the report of the Special Representative of the Secretary General because they committed many acts of kidnapping and recruitment. Even today, many of them are in Houthi prisons in inhumane conditions, and that's why it's incumbent on the international community to ramp up its efforts to put pressure on these militia to immediately and unconditionally free all of the detainees, including men also. It's also necessary to include members of UN personnel and representatives of civil society organisations and members of the diplomatic corps. Sanctions play a fundamental role in this regard, and it is necessary to put an end to impunity in order to break this cycle of violence. By way of conclusion, we reiterate the importance of international cooperation to fight against conflict-related sexual violence. It is necessary to exchange information and experiences and to ensure technical and financial support to different women, peace and security programs in order to guarantee women's right to live a life of dignity and security. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the delegation of Yemen for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank Panama for facilitating this annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, a topic that remains extremely important, particularly as we grapple to maintain and promote standards of international law that were developed over decades. We thank the Secretary General Special Representative Ms. Patten and Ms. Ahmed for their valuable insights on this pertinent issue. It has been 17 years since this Council agreed to condemn conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of war. Since then, the integrated institutional architecture created in 2009 has allowed for further progress to be made on this matter. Despite the notable advances made by SRSG Patten and her two predecessors, we cannot afford to halt pursuit of eradicating the abhorrent scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. As long as this war crime continues, the pursuit of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building will always be more difficult to achieve. With this in mind, the international community must recognize that each context is unique and requires context-specific approaches towards eradicating this heinous crime in conflict settings. We need to recognize and respond to the nexus between instability, weakened governance institutions, and the increase in sexual violence. Evidence is abound that poor rule of law and weakened state authority may result in increased sexual violence as states and non-state actors conduct themselves with impunity and without accountability. It is vital to ensure that not only the rule of law and state institutions are strengthened, but that transitional justice processes, where relevant, must include appropriate provisions for redress of conflict-related sexual violence with the active involvement of affected individuals and communities. The prevention of this crime must be conducted through whole-of-society approaches with a reinforcement of adequate government policies. Additionally, we should deepen collaboration amongst various actors. Actions such as prevention, protection, and provision of support to survivors should be rooted in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Efforts must be directed at addressing this scourge at the national, regional, and international levels to harmonize and create greater impact. The UN should thus work closely in cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations as appropriate. Mr. President, South Africa recognizes the value of women's protection advisors and humanitarian coordinators, particularly in peace operations, and encourages their invaluable contribution in support of affected individuals and communities. Unfortunately, we are concerned by the limited resources allocated for such personnel and strongly advocate for their support in a predictable and sustainable manner. As UN budgets continue to diminish, there needs to be a greater partnership with local actors, particularly women's organizations and civil society. Such partnership includes the provision of services that can prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence through education platforms and legal, medical, and psychosocial assistance to those who have experienced this kind of violence. We call upon the international community to continue to support these local efforts. In closing, South Africa urges this Council and the entire UN system to further enhance the fight against conflict-related sexual violence, to improve on approaches that are inclusive, holistic, and gender-sensitive and responsive. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de... I thank the delegation of South Africa for your statement. I give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Guatemala. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We're grateful to Panama for convening this annual open debate on sexual violence in areas of conflict, and we acknowledge the distinguished speakers for their moving presentations. We regret the increase in the registered and verified cases of sexual violence, and even what's more devastating is that these figures are just a small portion of the total incidents. Most of these affecting women and girls. It's essential that all parties to a conflict put an immediate end to all forms of sexual violence and provide unfettered access to the affected areas to the United Nations and humanitarian actors. This means that the Council must guarantee constant monitoring of sexual violence and its systematic incorporation as a separate designation criteria for the imposition of sanctions to ensure that sanctions committees have specialized knowledge of this topic is essential, and to ensure that any discussion on peacekeeping operations, including any transition, reduction, or withdrawal of forces in any of these measures should be contemplated to prevent gaps in protection, and that there should be an appropriate response to this scourge, whose ultimate goal is to terrorize and paralyze civilian populations. We acknowledge that the existing institutional architecture to address sexual violence, and especially the work of advisors on the protection of women, has improved the database on this crime. This is essential for measures of prevention and response to provide comprehensive support to victims, prioritizing their rights, specific needs, and aspirations to empower them and to rebuild the rest of their lives. Mr. President, in the face of the dramatic reduction of financing for humanitarian assistance and the crisis of liquidity of the organization, it's important to highlight the importance of maintaining access to quality services and vital assistance geared in particular to survivors. Guatemala is unequivocal. The civilian infrastructure of healthcare cannot be the target of attacks during hostilities. Medical person and humanitarian personnel cannot be targets of attack. Comprehensive and without any discrimination medical support should be ensured with due support for mental health, psychosocial support, and legal assistance for due access to justice and reparations. Along these lines, we also highlight the irreplaceable work of civil society organizations, especially those present at the local level, and these are on the front lines in helping survivors, addressing the trauma they've experienced, and assisting in prevention of future cases. This is why we support the appeal to create an enabling environment for women who actively participate in public life, such as defenders of human rights, humanitarian workers, female journalists, and those that work on peace building and are directly working on the topic of conflict-related sexual violence. We fully support the recommendation of implementing measures such as urgent response mechanisms for cases of retaliation for cooperating with the United Nations and for other reasons. Lastly, Mr. President, efforts to empower women and young people in prevention of conflicts must be incorporated in broader strategies of peace building using existing mandates of the United Nations system. And this debate should lead to greater coordinated efforts, greater coherence and coordination to continue with the work of provision of multisectoral services in the network of action against sexual violence and conflict. Thank you very much. I thank Guatemala for your statement, and I give the floor to Kyrgyzstan.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank Panama Presidency for gathering us to the Security Council open debate on women, peace and security. We also appreciate esteemed speakers for their insights. It is my honor to speak on behalf of my country and to reaffirm our full commitment to advancing the principles of Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions that together form the cornerstone of the WPS framework. The Secretary General's latest report makes it unequivocally clear, despite 25 years of international consensus, progress on women, peace and security is too slow, fragmented and underfunded. Ladies and gentlemen, WPS agenda recognizes the essential role of women and communities in preventing conflict and building sustainable peace. Communities are not only victims of conflict, but also key drivers of transformation. Kyrgyzstan has a unique experience in repatriating its citizens from 2021, particularly women from conflict zones such as Syria and Iraq, where they ended up because of radicalization, manipulation, and human trafficking. Local councils have worked with repatriated women to support community-led reintegration. Reintegration program includes safe return and protection from stigma, medical, legal, and psychological services, education and training, community integration, and early warning measures to prevent the re-radicalization. This holistic, community-rooted model can serve as a blueprint for other post-conflict societies. Mr. President, the Kyrgyz Republic expresses its deepest concern over the continued and systematic use of sexual violence. Kyrgyzstan is consistently advancing its digital transformation, placing special emphasis on ensuring access to electronic government services for all, including women in vulnerable situations. The President of Kyrgyzstan assigns strategic importance to this area by enhancing legislation, infrastructure, and digital services so that women can remotely access legal, social, educational, and medical assistance, as well as participate in economic and public life. We propose the following 3 strategic approaches to enhance survivor protection. First, we must ensure that protection from sexual violence is integrated into peacekeeping frameworks. Second, we call for investment in innovative technologies to improve early warning and rapid response. Third, Kyrgyzstan supports the creation of military humanitarian corridors and the protection of health infrastructure. Mr. President, in conclusion, let me highlight that addressing sexual violence is not optional. It is a core part of building safe, inclusive, and resilient societies. We must enhance the effectiveness of UN peacebuilding, respecting human rights and equal participation of women in peace processes. We must focus on women, children, and security nexus. Women and children disproportionately suffer from wars and conflicts, while the problem of insufficient participation of women in solving problems of international peace and security is evident. It is important to encourage activities aimed at enhancing the role of women in conflict resolution. I thank you.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of Kyrgyzstan for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Kuwait.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أتشرف بأن
Thank you, President. It's my honor to take the floor on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation States, that is the UAE, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Sultanate of Oman, the State of Qatar, and my country, the State of Kuwait. Mr. President, we wish to thank the United Nations Secretary General for his comprehensive report on conflict-related sexual violence, covering the period from January to December 2024. This report contains terrible facts that remind us that we are still a long way off achieving the desired results, despite the commitments that we've made. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war and as a weapon of political repression across the world. The member states of the Security Council, as well as of the United Nations in general, cannot ignore the fact that this sexual violence is systematic and premeditated and seeks to undermine the social fabric and to terrorize the populations and to force them to displace themselves. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries welcomed the notification on Israel, who may feature among the parties involved in sexual violence in times of conflict, and this based on the different situations that have been documented against women, men and children, Palestinian women, men and children, in particular those in custody. We particularly condemn the actions carried out by the occupation, who have deprived UN parties from being able to visit occupied Palestinian territories. The occupying power is blocking the mandate of these institutions. These visits must be able to be carried out unconditionally. Furthermore, the Palestinian victims are not experiencing individual accidents. What's happening is systematic and thus far is still unpunished. So this notification extended to Israel, the occupying power, is a fundamental step towards achieving accountability and a recognition of the violence committed against the Palestinian population. Furthermore, the DRC, Myanmar, and other countries have experienced collective trauma due to sexual violence, in particular, sexual violence motivated by ethnicity. And this is why we call upon all parties concerned to cooperate with UN agencies in order to facilitate access for these agencies rather than stopping it, in order to document the crimes and to ensure full comprehensive protection for victims, as well as medical, psychosocial and legal support. It's also necessary to fight against retaliations, reprisals perpetrated against these victims. Mr. President, the continuation of these systematic crimes undermine the foundations of international peace and security, which contributes to the suffering of the affected populations. Silence in the face of these acts constitutes unacceptable complicity. For this reason, it is necessary to act on an international level in order to dissuade these practices and to ensure accountability, because nobody should go unpunished. We're particularly concerned about the situation of impunity that continues to prevail. Indeed, more than 70% of the perpetrators of these crimes have remained on the list contained in this report for more than 5 years without any effective measures being taken against them, and that is unacceptable. Accountability is not a political option, rather what it is a legal and moral obligation. The survivors must have access to justice. Justice must be served, and it must be served at national courts or even by international courts if required. The report also draws our attention to the lack of financing of services provided to the victims. It is necessary to implement international obligations on protection because victims require medical support, psychosocial support, and legal support. They need to be reintegrated into society and into the economies of their countries, not only following the incidents in question, but also on the long term as well. We support the recommendations of the Secretary-General, and we wish to insist on the following: on the needs to strengthen sanctions against the perpetrators of these crimes, including travel bans and asset freezes. It's also necessary to consider sexual violence as a fully fledged criteria, a standalone crime to be included on the lists. Furthermore, it's necessary to prohibit any person involved in such crimes from participating in any public or government role. It's necessary to implement ceasefire agreements and peace agreements by strengthening oversight mechanisms. It's also necessary to deploy the advisors that deal with sexual-based violence to peacekeeping operations. It's also necessary to provide support to victims and to survivors and to raise more awareness. By way of conclusion, we insist on the fact that sexual violence is not inevitable, In wartime, it is a crime that we can prevent. The eradication of this crime requires real political will, it requires accountability and constant support to the victims. We owe the victims and the survivors whose suffering has been documented in this report, we owe them, as well as those whose suffering has not been documented, those whose stories we've not been able to listen to, we owe all of them protection. I thank the representative of Q8 for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Deputy PR of Austria.
Mr. President, Austria aligns itself with the statements delivered by the EU and by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. We commend Panama for organizing this debate and thank SRSG Patten for her comprehensive presentation and tireless efforts to fulfill her mandate. Let me also thank Ms. Ahmed for courageously sharing her insights. The proliferation and escalation of conflicts with extensive conflict-related sexual violence is alarming. 25 years after the Council's adoption of landmark Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, and 17 years since its clear condemnation in Resolution 1888 of the use of sexual violence, including as a tactic of war, deep-rooted gender inequality persists worldwide as the main invisible driver of CRSV. Austria strongly condemns all forms of CRSV. It's imperative to address pre-existing societal inequalities and discrimination against women and girls, which render them especially vulnerable to and the primary targets of sexual and gender-based violence. Men, boys, and persons with diverse gender identities are also affected. CRSV causes physical and psychological trauma and stigma, which can haunt several generations and even societies as a whole. Austria stands in solidarity with all victims and survivors and their families, including children born of rape. We stand for a survivor-centered approach and the provision of access to urgent medical and psychosocial care. It's the responsibility of each state to ensure access to justice for CRSV survivors and that perpetrators are held accountable by law. In this regard, we reiterate our full support to the International Criminal Court and UN-mandated commissions of inquiry. We join the Secretary General's call upon all parties to conflict to immediately cease all forms of CRSV. Under international law, CRSV can amount to a war crime, a crime against humanity, and a crime of torture. Compliance with relevant Security Council resolutions is not optional, but something all member states have explicitly agreed to under Article 25 of the UN Charter. UN teams must be granted unimpeded access to monitor situations on the ground and collect data necessary to hold offenders accountable. We further call upon all listed parties and other perpetrators to make and implement specific time-bound commitments and action plans to combat sexual violence in line with international obligations and the SG's recommendations. Mr. President, Austria commends and will continue to support UN Women, as well as the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, the UN Team of Experts on the Rule of Law and Sexual Violence in Conflict, as well as UNFPA. Let me also highlight the immense contributions of civil society organizations, in particular of local women's and women-led organizations, in preventing and responding to CRSV, and the importance of the humanitarian development peace nexus. Finally, in this important anniversary year, Austria calls upon the entire membership and Security Council members in particular to jointly recommit to the WPS agenda and the robust framework of international obligations and norms relating to CRSV. Rest assured that Austria will remain a staunch supporter of WPS and this Council efforts to put an end to CRSV. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Austria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Panama for convening this important open debate. I also wish to express my appreciation to SRSG's Pramila Patten and Ms. Ahmed for their insightful and sobering statements. Myanmar is alarmed by the recent UNSG report underscoring the staggering 25% increase in the perpetrations of CRSV from previous year. The consequences of this war crime have been severely affecting many countries, including my own country, Myanmar. In Myanmar, patriarchal culture is one of the many factors which causes CRSV. The environment for women and girls to live safely and peacefully has been shrinking in the country since the 2021 illegal military coup. The perpetrators, starting by overthrowing the elected civilian government, arbitrarily detaining political leaders, and suppressing peaceful democratic protests, have been committing atrocities that are amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The junta's daily atrocity, especially the conduct of indiscriminate airstrikes and area bombings against civilians, have displaced over 3.5 million people and made over 20 million in need of humanitarian assistance. Moreover, it has killed over 7,100 people, including women. Only 2 days ago, on 17 August, the junta forces carried out an area bombing on Mochi village in Kaya State, killing 32 people, including women and children. The military junta continues using sexual violence to attack the civilian population as part of its modus operandi. This sexual violence includes rape, including with objects, and gang rape, sexual slavery, sexualized torture, sexual mutilation, sexual assaults at military checkpoints, and forced nudity. It is reported that around 500 cases of CRSV have been documented between February 2021 and June 2024. While the number of these incidents is still on the rise, higher volume of such crimes is silently taking place in the junta's detention center. Women and female youth political activists are subject to multiple forms of torture and sexual violence. Just last month, 2 female political prisoners, one aged at 26 and the other 44, died in prison. Sometimes sexual violence, including rapes by junta forces, took place in front of husbands, father, mother, sisters, brothers, children, and relatives. This junta's cruelty is unspeakable and widespread and systematic. Against this horrific backdrop, Mr. President, the National Unity Government, the EROs, CSOs, and local community groups are working together to protect women and girls and to seek justice for victims by setting up domestic complaints monitoring and investigative mechanisms and to provide life savings and other necessary assistance to the people in need. Moreover, courageous Myanmar women CSO groups and human rights defenders have been serving at the forefront to resist against the military junta and raise voices on behalf of the vulnerable communities. We have to state that we ourselves alone cannot stop the junta's heinous crime timely, and we need help from the international community, in particular the UN Security Council, to protect our helpless people, including women and girls. Effective action of the UN Security Council and the other UN bodies matter to save lives and protect women and girls from such atrocities, as well as bring justice for victims of CRSV. To conclude, Mr. President, I wish to make the following appeal. First, I wish to request all of us to take a pause for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of those victims, their fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, children, and relatives. Then let's think of their daily life in their conflict settings and secure environment and the prevalence of junta's atrocities. Every second, every minute, every hour count for them. Second, therefore, I appeal to the members of the Security Council, UN member states, the UN system, to take immediate, concrete actions by using all tools available to stop junta's atrocities and save lives of innocent civilians. The junta's heinous crimes are already documented, and they are available for such actions. Third, I also call on all member states to take all available ways and means to stop flows of weapons, jet fuel, dual-use items, and the financial assistance to the military junta. The military junta is using them to commit such atrocities. Fourth, the junta's planned sham election will not be a free, fair, and inclusive, and is a deceitful process to hold onto power illegally at the expense of people's life and our future. The sham election will give the military a license to commit further heinous crimes, including CRSV, against the population in Myanmar. We have to stop it. Therefore, I urge all member states to respect the aspirations of the people of Myanmar and to categorically reject the junta's sham election. Fifth, and finally, I appeal to the international community to strongly support our endeavor to end the military dictatorship and build a federal democratic union. The future of Myanmar will ensure peace, stability, prosperity, justice, and accountability for all. Please act now to save lives of Myanmar people and their future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Myanmar for his statement. I'd like to remind all delegations that they must stick to a maximum of 3 minutes for intervention so that the Council can finish its work expeditiously. The microphone will start flashing at the end of the 3 minutes. I now give the floor to the representative of Sudan.
Mr. President, allow me to express our gratitude to the Permanent Mission of Panama to convene this important meeting and also to express our appreciation to SRSG Patten and her office for their dedicated efforts. Mr. President, in the thick of the gravest humanitarian crisis in Sudan's modern history due to the war of aggression by the genocidal RSF militia and its regional sponsor, the government of Sudan exerted every effort to combat and eradicate sexual violence and gender-based violence. Allow me first to emphasize two key issues. First, the unwavering commitment and the consistent devotion of the government in addressing CRSV. Second, the commitment to prioritize and to implement accountability measures and to address any individual violations. Several decisive measures were taken in this regard. In April this year, the government of Sudan took a pivotal step by signing the renewed framework of cooperation with the United Nations to address CRSV. This was not a symbolic gesture, it is a signal of commitment backed by action. The government of Sudan is working across sectors to ensure that CRSV is treated not as an inevitable consequence of conflict, but as a preventable and prosecutable crime. The agreement is a step forward in ensuring the protection of women and girls and a powerful tool for ending sexual violence in conflict. Starting today, August 19th, and continuing until August 27th, a technical team from the Office of SRSG will be visiting Sudan in the context of implementing the framework of cooperation. In addition, bold steps have been undertaken to institutionalize survivor-centered care, to expand protection services across the country by implementing training programs on prevention and protection measures, strengthening the justice and health response, empowering adolescent girls in combating child marriage, harassment, and harmful practices, also advocacy for women and girls with disabilities, in addition to leading efforts to legalize abortion in cases of sexual violence. These efforts aim to enhance service quality and ensure that survivors receive coordinated, respectful, and rights-based care. As the profound responsibility of the government is to protect civilians, including survivors of sexual violence, the concerned authorities are in an ongoing preparations to develop the national operational framework for shelters in compliance with the international protection standards in humanitarian settings and emergencies, in addition to establishing special protection committees to conduct training for volunteers from IDPs camps aimed to enhancing awareness and enforcing local protection measures. To conclude, we believe that the international community should recognize the critical role of the government and its national institutions alongside with the local NGOs and partner with them in expanding survivor-centered rights-based approach across the country, especially during this challenging phase and the escalating use of sexual violence as a weapon of war by the RSF militia. Survivors of conflict-related sexual violence need more than just legal justice. They need comprehensive services that include healthcare, mental health care, legal support, and social reintegration. We must ensure that these services are accessible, sustainable, and that they respect the dignity of survivors. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of Sudan for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of El Salvador.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank you for organising this open debate. Our country aligns itself with the statement made by Canada on behalf of the group of friendly countries to women, peace and security. El Salvador, Mr. President, most strongly condemns conflict-related sexual violence, and we express our profound concern over the fact that it persists as a tactic of war, an instrument of torture, and a method of political repression and a tool of terrorism. According to the most recent Secretary-General's report, thousands of cases were documented, and many perpetrated by actors who have repeatedly featured in the annexes for years without preventive measures, effective preventive measures being adopted. This repeat offending and the low level of compliance with international norms reflect a concerning lack of political will. Mr. President, El Salvador therefore reiterates that this Council must continue to systematically address in a cross-cutting manner this issue with decisions that translate into concrete actions with impact. First of all, it's essential that peacekeeping operations and other UN presences on the ground benefit from sufficient resources and capacities, including the deployment of gender advisors and women's protection. During transitions or during the withdrawal of missions, the continuity of oversight mechanisms must be guaranteed, as well as analysis and notification mechanisms, as well as the support provided to communities to prevent protection voids that imperil the achievements made and the progress made. Second, the threats and attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel that have reached unprecedented levels must be prevented and punished, ensuring their ability to assist the survivors and to contribute to accountability. Thirdly, we call for including systematically conflict-related sexual violence as a criteria for all relevant sanctions regimes, ensuring coherence between the parties contained in the Secretary-General's reports and the designations of those regimes. Fourthly, it's essential to combat impunity and close the gaps that limit access to justice. The survivors must benefit from medical attention, psychosocial support, effective reparations, and safe ways of accessing formal justice. 5, we recognise the need to address this phenomenon also through disarmament and arms control instruments, particularly when it comes to conventional weapons. It's important to agree on concrete measures to promote the participation of women in all decision-making processes, to address the differentiated impacts of their illicit trafficking, and to strengthen the collection of disaggregated data for more focused policies. Finally, we must address the root causes of this violence, combating gender inequality and promoting the full equitable and meaningful participation of women in public life and in all peace processes and processes for reconciliation and reconstruction. El Salvador reaffirms its firm commitment to work alongside this Council to prevent and to respond to conflict-related sexual violence and to ensure that the survivors receive the protection and services that they deserve. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the permanent representative of El Salvador for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Burundi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Burundi would like to thank the Panamanian presidency of the Security Council for organizing this open debate on a topic of extreme seriousness, of a humanitarian security or moral impact that is undeniable, and that is conflict-related sexual violence. We also applaud the report of the Secretary General and the Special Representative in charge of this issue and their continued efforts on the prevention, response, and fighting against the impunity of these heinous acts. Mr. President, Burundi is clear, and no circumstance can justify using sexual violence in times of conflict. This is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law, of human rights, and the fundamental principles of our common humanity. We fully support the normative framework established by the Security Council, in particular resolutions 1820, 1888, 1960, 2106, 2331, and 2467. They form the backbone of the collective response to sexual violence in a period of conflict. We share the concerns expressed by several delegations regarding the fact that in many contexts, survivors of sexual violence continue to confront significant obstacles to have access to essential assistance. This reality is particularly worrisome in situations where withdrawal or of peacekeeping operations or a transition leads to security or institutional vacuums. On this point, Burundi considers that the Security Council and regional organizations have a crucial role to play to anticipate these transitions by ensuring that protection measures and services to support survivors are neither suspended or compromised. Coordination with the national authorities and local actors is very important to ensure effective continuity of interventions. Furthermore, humanitarian access to zones of conflict must be maintained in conformity with international law. We call on all parties to respect and protect essential civilian infrastructures, in particular healthcare facilities, which often are the first line of support for survivors. The targeting or destruction of these infrastructures is unacceptable and must be firmly condemned. Burundi also would like to underscore the importance of multi-sectoral services, medical services, psychosocial support, legal support, socioeconomic reintegration. These services must be adapted to local realities. They must be culturally sensitive and accessible without any discrimination. We encourage member states to strengthen their financial and logistical support to these services, including through bilateral, multilateral channels or through partnerships with community organizations. Mr. President, we're convinced that the meaningful participation of women and girls, including survivors, in the design and implementation of prevention and response strategies is essential. This is in line with the spirit and the letter of the program Women, Peace and Security that Burundi actively supports. In the context of displacement that exacerbate the vulnerability of women and girls, targeted protection mechanisms, including early warning systems that are gender sensitive, must be strengthened. Solutions must involve the displaced women themselves because they are in the best position to identify their needs and propose sustainable solutions. Lastly, the fight against impunity is a fundamental pillar of any credible response. Burundi supports efforts aimed at documenting violations, investigating and persecuting those responsible in line with international norms while putting the dignity, security, and informed consent of survivors at the center of any judicial process. Mr. President, Burundi is determined to cooperate with the United Nations, with regional and international partners to ensure effective, humane, and response respectful of the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. These crimes must never remain unpunished. Our commitment is unequivocal. Thank you. I thank the representative of Burundi for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, my delegation expresses appreciation to Panama for convening this important and timely debate. We also thank the Secretary General for his report and the briefers for their invaluable insights. Malaysia strongly condemns the use of sexual violence as a method of war, torture, and terror in armed conflict. The Secretary General's report reveals a 25% increase in verified cases of CRSV in 2024. This significant rise underscores the persistence of sexual violence as a weapon of war and a tool of repression in many conflict zones. The report also highlights that these crimes remain vastly underreported, especially in detention settings, and continue to affect communities long after conflict ends. Malaysia is gravely concerned by the findings related to the situation in Palestine, especially Gaza. We note with serious alarm the Secretary General's decision to place Israel under formal notice for potential listing in the next reporting period, owing to credible allegations of sexual violence, which continue without preventive action or accountability. Reports of sexual violence, including in detention, as well as during military operations in Gaza, demand our urgent attention. To address these concerns effectively, Malaysia proposes the following priorities. First, we reiterate the importance of demilitarization, disarmament, and arms control. As highlighted in the Secretary General's report, the proliferation and widespread availability of weapons contributes to an environment where sexual violence is enabled and sustained. Reducing arms and dismantling the infrastructure of violence are key steps toward prevention. Second, we urge the strengthening of UN monitoring mechanisms. This includes full and unhindered access for MARA teams and other investigative bodies in all situations of concern, including in the occupied Palestinian territory. Reliable data and independent verification are essential to understanding the full scale of sexual violence in conflict and ensuring accountability. Third, we highlight the importance of ensuring gender-responsive peacekeeping efforts. Malaysia continues to contribute actively to UN peacekeeping missions. Currently, 94% Malaysian women serve among 865 Malaysian peacekeepers. Women peacekeepers build trust with local communities and provide essential support to survivors of CRSV. Mr. President, Malaysia welcomes the inclusion of the situation in Palestine in the current report. However, we regret that the information on sexual violence in Gaza remains insufficiently elaborated. We call for independent, impartial, and transparent investigations into all credible allegations of sexual violence, particularly those involving Israeli forces, without discrimination or double standards. Justice for victims and survivors must not be selective. It must be based on international law and consistently applied. To conclude, conflict-related sexual violence remains a widespread and devastating violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. The time for half measures is long past. Only through coordinated international action, survivor-centered approaches, and genuine accountability can we begin to break the cycles of impunity and trauma. Malaysia remains fully committed to supporting the UN's work on CRSV, advancing justice for survivors, and ensuring that every victim is seen, heard, and protected. I thank you.
Okay. Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Armenia.
President, we express our appreciation to the Presidency of Panama and the UN Security Council for holding the open debate on women, peace, and security, also thanking the briefers for their valuable interventions. This October will mark the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which serves as a pertinent reminder that peace and security efforts are more sustainable when women are equal partners in the prevention of violent conflict, the delivery of relief and recovery efforts, and in forging of lasting peace. The Republic of Armenia has approached this symbolic date with a vast range of various initiatives and activities aimed at the advancement of the WPS agenda. The elaboration of Armenia's third National Action Plan, Women, Peace and Security, titled Investing in Global Peace, attests to the political will of the government of Armenia to ensure women's full engagement in matters related to peace and security. Its forthcoming adoption will reaffirm our commitment and strategic vision to advance the peace agenda, including through the full implementation of Resolution 1325. The government of Armenia attaches utmost importance to the empowerment of women in all spheres of public life, including the decision-making level. Women constitute 30% of ministers in the current government and more than 38% of deputies of the National Assembly of Armenia, manifesting the resolve of the government to foster a more inclusive and equitable society where women's voices are not only heard and acknowledged, but also actively sought in decision-making processes. Gender mainstreaming is among the priority aspects of security sector governance and reform in Armenia. For the first time in its history, Armenia has a female Minister of Internal Affairs and a woman heading the Foreign Intelligence Service. Police reforms envisage 30% of women participation in patrol service. Armenia is committed to advancing involvement of women in UN peacekeeping missions to reach the UN established threshold of 15%. Mr. President, Armenia's third National Action Plan places significant emphasis on addressing the specific needs of vulnerable and marginalized groups, in particular forcibly displaced women refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. Notably, it seeks to provide tailored support, including psychological assistance, capacity-building programs, and other forms of assistance aimed at creating sustainable living conditions and ensuring that their rights are protected within the broader framework of the WPS agenda. We would like to underscore the necessity of multi-stakeholder approach in implementation of the WPS agenda. In this regard, the National Action Plan encourages meaningful engagement with civil society organizations and community actors to promote community-based peace-building efforts. By fostering these partnerships and promoting a multi-level approach to cooperation, the NAP aims to create a unified framework addressing the nexus between peace and development, thereby reinforcing Armenia's commitment to advancing gender equality and women's rights as fundamental components of sustainable peace. Mr. President, amid the global need to advance the protection of women and girls in conflict settings, and their full, equal, and meaningful participation in peace processes, Armenia stands ready to share best practices and collaborate with international partners and civil society to strengthen implementation of women, peace, and security agenda. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Armenia for his statements, and I now give the floor to the PR of Angola.
Mr. President, we would like to commend the delegation of Panama for leading the Council's work during this month and for convening this important open debate. Mr. President, Angola is very concerned with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' annual report released Thursday, which indicated that sexual violence in conflict worldwide increased by 25% last year. More disturbing is the fact that he recognized that the UN verified figures don't reflect the global scale and prevalence of these crimes. Governments in conflict-affected countries continue to be slow to act, and global efforts to address the root causes of conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, and ensure justice for victims have proven inadequate. Mr. President, in Africa, we continue to witness alarming levels of CRSV and gender-based violence in conflict situations, including most notably in Sudan and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, exacerbated by political, military, and economic factors. As a response to the urgent need for gender justice and recognition of violence against women and girls as violation of human rights, in February 2025, the 38th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union adopted the African Union Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. This landmark legal instrument established a binding framework that addressed the root cause of violence, strengthened legal and institutional mechanisms, and promotes a culture of respect for human rights, gender equality, and the dignity of women and girls. The Convention's comprehensive approach is expected to contribute to more coherence and comprehensive measures across African Union member states for preventing and responding to all forms of violence against women and girls. As the next steps, it will be important to speed up the ratification of this convention and its domestication as a prerequisite for creating the legal, political, and social conditions that promote respect for physical security and dignity of women and girls in Africa. Mr. President, Angola defends a proactive rather than a reactive approach to respond to conflict-related sexual violence and eliminate all forms of violence against women. In this vein, allow us to make 4 recommendations. First, address CRSV from a victim-survivor-centered approach that respects their rights, needs, and choice, and do not expose them to further physical and psychological harm and stigma. Second, at the country level, capacitate justice institutions to be able to effectively investigate and prosecute CRSV and enforce disciplinary action against perpetrators and facilitators of such crimes. Third, in the context of UN 80 initiative, reinstate global funding whose cuts have drastically affected programs providing medical treatment, psychological support, legal assistance, and safe space designate to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, particularly in Africa. Fourth, prioritize CRSV in peace negotiation, security sector reform, and ensure that conflict parties commit to investigating and prosecuting sexual violence cases, vetting security personnel, and barring those with known records of abuse from positions of authority. Mr. President, for Angola, an increased representation of women at all decision-making levels in national, regional, and international institutions under Resolution 1325 can ensure a gender approach to peacemaking and mediation, particularly in specific conflict situations, leaving women and girls dangerously exposed. It is fundamental and urgent and sustainable action to address the conflict-related sexual violence, which has devastating consequences globally, particularly in Africa, a still conflict-prone continent. In this context, we call upon all parties to a conflict to comply with the rules of international law, particularly those in relation to the protection of women. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Angola for his statements, and I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
President, Liberia thanks Panama for convening this timely and vital open debate. We express appreciation to the Secretary General for his report and to the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Patten, for her compelling briefing. We also recognize the moving briefing by Ms. Ikhlass Ahmed. We commend the work of the United Nations and its partners who remain at the forefront of efforts to confront this devastating weapon of war, repression, and control. Despite strong international frameworks, including Security Council resolutions 1325, 1820, 1888, among others, conflict-related sexual violence persists. Its tactics evolve, its targets shift, and its impacts remain most severe for women and girls and those in already marginalized communities. President, Liberia knows this trauma intimately. our nation has walked the painful path of recovery from conflict, where sexual violence was used to terrorize and subjugate. From that experience, we know both the deep scars such crimes leave and the critical role of survivor-centered justice and resilience. That is why we advocate not only for new tools and technologies, but for systemic innovation, strategies that respect survivors' dignity and restore their agency. Let me outline several strategies Liberia considers vital in addressing this challenge. Firstly, we believe in the power of community-based response networks. In Liberia, women-led community watch groups, supported by traditional leaders, have proven effective in identifying risk, referring survivors, and raising awareness. These grassroots mechanisms bring services closer to those in need. They must be supported, scaled, and protected, especially in fragile contexts. Secondly, mobile and digital solutions are essential in areas where conflicts have disrupted infrastructure. Liberia has deployed mobile health clinics, toll-free hotlines, and SMS-based reporting platforms. These tools have proven invaluable in connecting survivors to services, but they must be secure, confidential, and survivor-friendly. Greater investment is needed to ensure real-time access to medical, legal, and psychological support, even in the most remote and dangerous areas. Thirdly, we must eliminate fragmented service delivery. Survivors should not bear the burden of navigating complex systems. In Liberia, we have integrated sexual and gender-based violence services into our national health infrastructure, bringing together medical treatment, psychological support, legal aid, and shelter. We urge similar models to be adopted in humanitarian and peacekeeping settings with adequate funding and coordination. Fourthly, legal accountability must be a priority. Impunity fuels repetition. Liberia supports the deployment of mobile courts to remote areas and is committed to trauma-informed judicial reform. We believe in legal frameworks that prioritize the needs of survivors while ensuring justice is done. Courts must become spaces where stigma is dismantled, not reinforced. Fifth, we must place survivors at the center of our responses, not just as beneficiaries, but as leaders, allowing them the much-needed space and time to heal and recover without the extra weight of trauma. Their participation in shaping and monitoring our strategies is essential. It is not only just, it is what makes interventions effective. Liberia reaffirms the Women, Peace, and Security agenda as central to ensuring this participation is meaningful and sustained. President, we cannot ignore that sexual violence and conflict is increasingly systematic and targeted. It is used to ethnically cleanse, displace, terrorize populations. Displacement settings where governance structures have collapsed and protection is thin present heightened risk. Women and girls are especially vulnerable. We commend the humanitarian organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, the International Rescue Committee, UNFPA, and countless local women's groups who operate under immense pressure to deliver life-saving services. Their courage must be matched with global solidarity and practical support. Allow me now to address the guiding questions before the Council. As peacekeeping missions transition or draw down, the threat does not disappear. We urge the Council to ensure that conflict-related sexual violence is integrated into mission exit strategies, sustaining protection mandates, investing in local institutions, and maintaining support for civil society. Transitional justice must not be abandoned at the point of mission closure. On humanitarian assets, the Council must demand unimpeded entry for humanitarian actors and protect them under international law. Political obstacles and bureaucratic delays that prevent survivors from receiving care must be called out and removed. Attacks on hospitals and women's centers are not incidental. They are targeted strikes against survivors' only lifelines. Such actions are war crimes. The Council must prioritize the protection of civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. Multi-sectoral service delivery must become the norm, not the exception. That means coordinated efforts to provide medical treatment, mental health support, legal aid, and reintegration assistance. These responses must be well-founded, locally tailored, and built for sustainability. On financial support, Liberia calls on donors to increase both core and flexible funding for local and national service providers. Women-led organizations, often the first to respond and the last to leave, must be prioritized. Their work must not be treated as supplementary. It is essential. We further call on member states and the United Nations system to institutionalize survivor participation, not as symbolic representation, but as core requirement in planning, implementation, and accountability. This is in line with resolutions 2467 and 1325 and reinforces legitimacy and trust in our collective efforts. In displacement settings, protection strategies must be gender-sensitive and survivor-centered. Safe spaces, mobile services, and survivor-run shelters are critical. Women-led organizations must be embedded in the governance of these spaces, not excluded from them. And finally, on accountability, perpetrators, whether they be peacekeepers, must face justice through international mechanisms. The Council must strengthen support for evidence preservation, ensure survivor protection, and enhance cooperation across borders. But justice must never come at the expense of the survivors. It must be trauma-informed and designed to do no further harm. President, conflict-related sexual violence is not a byproduct of war. It is a deliberate tactic, a strategy, and a crime. We must meet it with an equally deliberate and strategic response, rooted in law, built on justice, driven by survivors, and fueled by international solidarity. Liberia stands ready to work alongside all partners to ensure that survivors receive not only protection and safe living spaces and services, but also the justice, empowerment, and peace they deserve. Let us turn pain into policy and policy into protection. I thank you.
Agradezco a Liberia por su...
I thank Liberia, and I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Colombia. Mr. President, Colombia is grateful to Panama for convening this very timely debate. My delegation would like to stress the need for a holistic approach focused on victims, based on rights and informed by the trauma, and that responds to the differentiated impact on women, girls, men, and boys. My delegation would like to start by unequivocally condemning all actions related to sexual violence in the framework of armed conflict, as well as all the forms and manifestations of violence that are exercised on the bodies of women, girls, and teenagers. Beyond simply care and reparation, there's no doubt that we owe them a greater effectiveness in terms of prevention. The use of the bodies of women to commit violence takes form in structural dynamics that lead to discrimination and that are socially accepted in daily in daily behavior and that normalize violence against women. The report of the Secretary General confirms the increase in sexual violence related to conflicts, which makes this discussion very important, especially in the context of transitions from peacekeeping operations. We believe that it is essential that peacekeeping mechanisms include analyses of risks, gender-sensitive secure routes, and early warning indicators developed with national institutions, regional organizations, and women's groups. Transition agreements must envision monitoring, reporting, and mechanisms, as well as referral of victims, as well as a timely transfer of capacities to national and regional institutions. We applaud cooperation with the Special Representative, the UN Action, and the team of experts to strengthen accountability and provision of services to sustain multisectoral services in the context of conflict. It is essential to incorporate medical support, psychosocial support, access to justice, legal advice, reduction of the stigmatization, reintegration, and livelihood. It's also a priority to address the issue of girls and boys that are born as a result of rape and to invest in education as a protective measure. The meaningful participation of survivors in the design, implementation, and follow-up to responses is essential. A victim-centered approach and sensitive to the trauma must combine sanctions with restorative measures and guarantees of non-repetition, which requires predictable, flexible, and accessible financing. In cases of displacement, the registration, documentation, and prevention of exploitation is essential, as well as pathways towards education, employment, and legal identity. Based on our national experience, the final agreement of 2016 offers a robust framework with a restorative approach to address gender-based violence, including a territorial and ethnic approach. We will continue promoting comprehensive reparations, strengthening institutional capacities and community capacities, promoting the participation of women and community-based organizations in monitoring the commitments. Also, we will continue sharing good practices to ensure a more secure access, strengthened protection, and more effective accountability. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Colombia for your statement. The delegation of Pakistan has asked for the floor to make another statement.
Mr. President, I have been compelled to request the floor to respond to India's fallacious assertions. Pakistan rejects in its entirety the baseless and politically motivated allegations made by India. These falsehoods are nothing more than an attempt to deflect attention from India's own well-documented record of grave violations of international law and international humanitarian law, particularly in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as well as its systemic persecution, discrimination, and violence against minorities and marginalized communities within India. The reference to 1971 is yet another distortion of history. India's own military intervention in East Pakistan was a blatant violation of the UN Charter, and it is ironic that a country responsible for such actions now seeks to malign others. Mr. President, such diversionary tactics cannot obscure the truth. The BJP RSS government, which has ruled India since 2014, is guilty of imposing a reign of terror not only against the people of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but also its own over 200 million Muslims, 2 million Christians, and millions of Dalits and other low-caste Hindus. India's crimes are well documented, including the massacre in Gujarat, Mumbai, and Delhi, the frequent lynching of Muslims by co-vigilantes, the bulldozing of Muslim houses and shops, hate speech, including calls by political leaders and Hindutva houses and Hindutva priests for genocide against Muslims. Muslims are forcibly converted, bans imposed on the hijab, love hijab laws adopted, and hundreds of mosques, including the Babi Mosque, have been destroyed in a campaign to obliterate Muslims and their cultural heritage, the legacy of India. Mr. President, the world is also witness to India's epidemic of rape and sexual violence, where incidents such as horrific Delhi gang rape and countless other continue to shock global conscience. Reports, including those by India's own National Crime Records Bureau, reveal that crimes of sexual violence occur with alarming frequency and near total impunity. Mr. President, Pakistan will not be deterred by these tactics and will continue to speak firmly and consistently in support of international law, the UN Charter, and the inalienable right to self-determination of Kashmiri people. India needs to shun its hubris and hate-driven agenda and its state-sponsored terrorism against Pakistan, seize its oppression of Kashmiris, revoke all illegal and unilateral steps undertaken in the occupied territory, comply with its obligations under international law and UN Charter, including implementation of UN Security Council resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir dispute. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco. I thank the delegation of Pakistan for your statement.
I would like to extend a sincere thanks to interpreters and support staff for allowing the Council to conclude this important open debate this evening and for their patience. No hay más intervenciones.
There are no further speakers on the list. The meeting is adjourned.